My husband walked into my father's funeral 40 minutes late, and he did not walk in alone. I was standing at the front of the Ashwood Falls Community Chapel, third row from the casket, holding my daughter Emma's hand on one side and my son Tyler's on the other, and I heard the side door creak the way it always creaks, and I turned, the way you turn toward any sound in a room that quiet, and I watched my husband of 17 years, Grant Colston, walk down the side aisle in his good Navy suit with a woman I recognized immediately on his arm. Her name is Vanessa Cole. She is 33 years old. She was at that time still officially the senior accounts manager at Colston Restoration, the company Grant built out of a single pickup truck and a folding ladder 20 years ago, and she was wearing a black dress that was tasteful enough to pass in a glance for appropriate morning wear, and not tasteful enough to survive a second glance from any woman in that room who had ever had a reason to look closely at another woman standing next to her husband. I want to tell you that I gasped, or that my knees went weak, or that I felt the floor drop out from under me, the way people describe in these stories. I didn't. I felt something much quieter than shock and much colder, because by the time Grant walked into my father's funeral with his mistress on his arm, I had already known about Vanessa Cole for 14 months. I had known, and I had used every one of those 14 months to make sure that whatever he did next, whatever final humiliation he decided to hand me in a room full of people who loved my father, it would not be able to touch the parts of my life I had already moved out of his reach. My name is Rachel Colston. I am 42 years old, and I have lived in Ashwood Falls, Vermont, my entire life, in the kind of small town where the same 4 families have run the hardware store, the pharmacy, the diner, and the funeral home for 3 generations, where everybody at that funeral had known my father, Walter Doyle, for longer than I'd been alive, and where everybody at that funeral, within about 90 seconds of Grant walking through that side door, understood exactly what they were looking at. I want to walk you through what happened that day, because it is the day everyone remembers, the day people still bring up to me at the grocery store 18 months later with a certain careful softness in their voice. But I want to walk you through the 14 months before it even more carefully, because that is the part nobody saw, and it is the only reason I was able to stand in that chapel, watching my husband parade his mistress past my father's casket and feel something closer to readiness than despair. This is the true story of what he did, what I had already done long before he did it, and what happened to both of us after that chapel door closed. My father, Walter Doyle, was 74 years old when he died. He had been an electrician for the town of Ashwood Falls for 41 years, the kind of man who kept his truck registration in a leather folder in the glove compartment and updated it personally every single year on the day it was due rather than the day it arrived. Because he did not believe in doing things at the last possible minute, a philosophy he tried, with limited success, to pass on to me. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in April, 18 months before he died, and those 18 months were the hardest stretch of my adult life for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with my marriage, and everything to do with watching a man who had fixed every broken thing in my childhood slowly become a thing that could not be fixed. My mother, Carol, had died 11 years earlier, breast cancer, and so my father's illness fell on me and my younger brother, Danny Doyle, who lived 2 hours away in Burlington with his own wife and kids, which meant that, in practice, most of the day-to-day of it fell on me because I lived 12 minutes from my father's house, and Danny did not. I tell you all of that first before I tell you about Grant and Vanessa, because I need you to understand the specific kind of exhausted I was during the 14 months I'm about to describe. I was not a woman with the spare emotional bandwidth to go looking for problems in my marriage. I was a woman driving to my father's house 4 mornings a week before work to help him manage a feeding tube. A woman sitting through chemo appointments in a vinyl recliner, reading him the sports section because his eyes had gotten too tired for print. A woman lying awake most nights doing math about hospice costs and whether my father's pension would stretch far enough. I found out about Vanessa Cole in the middle of all of that, not because I went looking, but because grief, it turns out, has a strange side effect nobody warns you about. It strips away your capacity to perform normalcy you don't feel, which means it also strips away your capacity to ignore normalcy that isn't being performed correctly by the people around you. I noticed Grant before I noticed the affair, if that makes sense. I noticed that my husband had started performing being a supportive spouse during my father's illness with the exact careful, slightly overdone quality of a man reading from a script, and it was that performance, not any specific piece of evidence, that made me start paying attention in a way I hadn't been paying attention in years. Grant and I met when I was 23 at a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department that my father helped organize every summer on the town green, the kind of event with a dunk tank and a raffle, and folding tables of casseroles that every family in Ashwood Falls has attended at least once. Grant was 26, already running his own small restoration crew after 2 years working for somebody else, already the kind of confident that made him seem older than he was. And he bought $40 worth of raffle tickets in a single transaction specifically, he told me later, because I was the one selling them and he wanted an excuse to keep talking to me. We dated for 2 years, and I was 25 and Grant was 28 when we married, in the same chapel where my father's funeral would eventually be held, in front of 200 people. And for a long time, a genuinely long time, I would have told you without hesitation that I married the right man. Grant built Colston Restoration from nothing into a company with 31 employees and contracts across 3 counties. He coached Tyler's Little League team for 4 years. He was, for the great majority of our marriage, exactly who he appeared to be, which is part of why what happened in the last 2 years of it felt less like a betrayal by a stranger and more like watching a house I had lived in my whole life quietly rot from the inside without a single visible crack on the outside. We had Emma 3 years into the marriage, and Tyler 3 years after that, which makes Emma 14 now and Tyler 11, and I mention their ages now early, because everything I'm about to tell you happened with 2 specific children in the house, not abstract ones, children who had a specific school schedule and a specific fear of thunderstorms and a specific way of needing their mother to still seem like their mother even while she was quietly building an exit from a marriage neither of them knew was ending. 17 years is a long time to build a life with someone. It is long enough that I know exactly how Grant holds a coffee mug when he's lying about something small, and exactly how his jaw moves when he's lying about something large. And it is long enough that when I finally started noticing the second kind of jaw movement in the middle of the worst year of my father's illness, some old, tired, unsentimental part of me simply believed what I was seeing instead of arguing myself out of it the way I might have at 25. I want to describe my father before the cancer, briefly, because the version of him people met at the funeral, the frail man in the photograph on the easel by the guest book, is not the man who raised me, and I don't want him remembered wrong in the telling of this story. Walter Doyle stood 6'2" and could rewire a farmhouse by himself in a day when he was younger, and he had a laugh that carried across the whole hardware store, and he taught me to drive stick in the church parking lot on Sunday afternoons when I was 15, patient in a way he was not patient about almost anything else in his life. After my mother died, he did not remarry, did not really date as far as I know, spent 11 years alone in the house on Sycamore Street with a dog named Biscuit and a workshop full of half-finished birdhouses he made for the church fundraiser every fall. He adored Grant genuinely for most of the 17 years I was married to him. He taught Grant to fish. He co-signed the loan for Grant's first real box truck back when Colston Restoration was 2 guys and a trailer. When my father found out near the very end what Grant had been doing during his illness, it was, my brother Danny told me later, one of the only times in 11 years anyone had seen him cry in front of another person. And it wasn't about himself. I'll come back to that. I'm getting ahead of the story, which is a thing I have to be careful not to do because the order these things happened in matters enormously to understanding why I did what I did and when. The diagnosis came in April, delivered by Dr. Anand at the Regional Hospital in Montpelier, 40 minutes from Ashwood Falls, on a Tuesday afternoon while I sat in the exam room holding my father's good hand, the one that didn't have the IV bruise from blood work the week before. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, and Dr. Anand used the word aggressive twice in one sentence in the careful, flat voice doctors use when they've had this exact conversation with 100 other families and have learned that flat is kinder than gentle. My father's first question, and I remember this exactly, was not about himself. It was, will I make it to see Tyler graduate high school? And Tyler was 9 years old at the time, which meant my father was doing math about a future that was, we all understood without saying it out loud in that room, extremely unlikely to include him, and asking anyway because that's who he was. I called Grant from the hospital parking lot before I even called Danny. I remember exactly where I was standing, between a handicapped spot and a concrete planter with dead mums in it. And I remember Grant's voice on the phone. And I remember, this detail matters later, that he was quiet for a second too long before he said anything. And then he said all the right things. I'm coming home right now. Don't worry about anything at the office. We'll figure out the schedule. And I believed every word of it completely because I had no reason not to. Because in 17 years, Grant Colston had never once given me a reason to listen for the gap between what a person says and what a person means. I want to be honest that for the first 4 or 5 months after the diagnosis, Grant was, by any reasonable measure, a good husband. He picked up Tyler from practice on the days I had appointments with my father. He learned how to reschedule Emma's orthodontist visits without me having to remind him twice. If you had asked me in June of that year how my marriage was doing, I would have told you it was under strain, the way any marriage is under strain when a parent is dying, but fundamentally solid. Fundamentally, the same marriage it had always been. The change, when I look back on it now with the advantage of knowing what I know, started in late July, roughly 3 months after the diagnosis, roughly 1 month before I found the first piece of hard evidence, which places the actual beginning of the affair itself, based on what Grant eventually admitted and what Sharon Whitcomb's financial records later confirmed. Even earlier than that, a detail I will get to in its proper place because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. In late July, Grant started staying later at the Colston Restoration Office on Millbank Street, which was not unusual on its own. The company had just won a large contract restoring storm damage across 2 counties after a bad spring flood, and long hours were genuinely part of that season of the business. What was unusual was the specific quality of his exhaustion when he came home. A man tired from real work complains about the work. Grant stopped complaining about anything. He came home at 9, 9:30, sometimes 10, and he was almost aggressively cheerful about it, asking about my father with an attentiveness that felt, for the first time in 17 years, slightly rehearsed, like a man checking a box rather than a man who simply wanted to know. I didn't articulate any of this to myself as suspicion at the time. I was too tired and too grateful for whatever functional version of my husband showed up each night to interrogate the texture of his kindness. What I did notice, because I am a bookkeeper by training and profession, and because 14 years of managing accounts for the Ashwood Falls Regional Medical Clinic has trained a very specific, very literal part of my brain to notice when numbers don't reconcile, was the credit card statement in August. I handle our joint finances. I always have. It was simply the arrangement we fell into early in the marriage because I was better at it and didn't mind it. And in the first week of August, I was reconciling the joint visa statement the way I did every month. And I found a charge from the Bramfield Inn and Suites, a hotel 18 miles from Ashwood Falls, for $212, dated a Thursday, when Grant had told me he was staying late at the office working on the flood contract bids. I want to tell you what I did with that first hotel charge, because it is the first small decision in a chain of decisions that would eventually add up to everything I did over the following 14 months, and it tells you something true about how I am built. I did not confront him that night. I did not confront him that week. I sat with the credit card statement open on the kitchen table after Grant had gone up to bed, and I did the thing I have always done with any problem in my life since I was a girl watching my father methodically diagnose a wiring fault room by room instead of guessing. I asked myself what I actually knew, as opposed to what I was afraid of, and the honest answer was that I knew almost nothing yet. A hotel charge 18 miles away could be 100 things. It could be a client dinner that ran long and turned into drinks, turned into a room because driving home drunk wasn't worth the risk. It could be a mistake, a corporate card mixed up with a personal one. I am not a woman who burns her life down over a single line item, and some clear-eyed, almost clinical part of me understood, even in that very first moment, that if this turned out to be what some larger, quieter fear in my stomach was already telling me it was, I would need more than one hotel charge to build a life raft sturdy enough to hold 2 children. So I watched. That's the plainest way to say it. I started watching my own marriage the way I'd watch a patient's chart for a pattern the doctor hadn't caught yet, which is a strange and lonely thing to do inside your own home, checking the joint statement earlier in the month instead of waiting for the due date. Noticing which evenings Grant's stated whereabouts required a level of specificity he'd never bothered with before. In Manchester at the supplier conference, at the Rotary dinner in Bramfield, working late with Ned on the Peterson job walkthrough. Ned is Grant's younger brother, also in the business, a general contractor who handles field operations while Grant handled sales and estimates. And Ned is, I want to say clearly, not part of any of this, has no idea any of it was happening until far later than I did, and was, when it finally came out, angrier at his own brother than almost anyone else in Ashwood Falls. Angry in the specific way family gets angry, like a betrayal against the whole Colston name, and not just against me. By the second week of August, 3 weeks after the first hotel charge, I had found 2 more, both at the same Bramfield Inn and Suites, both on nights when Grant's story didn't fully match what I could verify with a few careful questions asked so casually he never once suspected he was being interviewed. I asked Ned, in what I made sound like idle wife small talk at a cookout at Grant's mother's house, whether the Peterson walkthrough had gone well, and Ned looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "What walkthrough? We finished Peterson in June, Rachel," and I smiled and said, "Oh, I must be thinking of a different job," and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the specific stillness of a fact locking into place. I want to tell you that this is the moment most people expect the confrontation to happen. It is not what happened. I went home that night, put the kids to bed, and lay awake next to Grant doing math, actual math on a legal pad in the bathroom with the fan running so the sound would cover the door, about what a divorce in the state of Vermont would actually mean for me, for Emma and Tyler, for the house on Birchwood Lane that we'd bought 9 years earlier, for a business that existed entirely in Grant's name, and that I had never once, in 17 years, insisted on understanding the actual financial structure of, because I trusted him, because why wouldn't I have, because that is what 17 years of an apparently good marriage teaches you to do. The confirmation, the piece of evidence that moved this from a cold suspicion I could theoretically still be wrong about into a certainty I had to build a plan around, came on the 22nd of August, a Friday. Grant kept a spare phone in the console of his work truck, an old cracked Colston Restoration Company phone that the crew used to use for job site photos before everyone just started using their personal phones. And I only knew it still existed because Tyler had left his baseball glove in Grant's truck that morning and asked me to grab it before practice, and the phone had slid out from under the passenger seat when I leaned across for the glove. Screen cracked, but still lit up with a text notification banner across the top. The contact name was VC Payroll. The message preview read, "In full, can't stop thinking about Thursday. Come by after Ned leaves tonight." I stood in my own driveway in my church clothes because it was a Sunday and we'd just gotten back from the 10 o'clock service, holding my son's baseball glove in one hand and my husband's second phone in the other. And I read that message 4 times, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after 3 weeks of carefully rationed suspicion, that whatever this was, it was not a misunderstanding about a corporate card. I did not throw the phone at his head, though I want to tell you honestly that I thought about it. Standing there in the driveway with Tyler already jogging toward the porch with his glove, already calling back over his shoulder that he'd be ready for practice in 5 minutes, oblivious, 11 years old and entirely uninterested in whatever his parents were doing in the driveway, as long as somebody drove him to the field on time. I put the phone back exactly where it had been, screen down, wedged under the seat the way it had been wedged, because some part of my brain, even in that first white-hot second, was already working faster than the rest of me, already understanding that the single worst thing I could do right now was let Grant know that I knew. Because a man who knows he's been caught starts covering tracks, moving money, changing passwords, getting his story straight, and a man who doesn't know he's been caught keeps behaving exactly like himself, which is a far more useful thing for me if I was going to need to actually prove any of this later, to a lawyer, to a judge, to myself in the middle of the night when I doubted my own eyes. I drove Tyler to practice. I sat in the bleachers next to Sandra Whitfield, whose son played third base, and I discussed the upcoming school bake sale for 45 minutes in a completely normal voice, while a woman named VC, who I did not yet know was Vanessa Cole from my husband's own accounting department, existed as a bright, ugly certainty at the center of my chest. That night, after Grant and the kids were asleep, I sat in my car in the driveway, engine off, dome light off, and I looked up V.C. on the Colston Restoration Staff Directory on my phone, which I had access to because I occasionally helped with quarterly bookkeeping questions Grant would text me from the office, a small irony that would matter a great deal later. There was exactly one VC on a staff of 31 employees, Vanessa Cole, Senior Accounts Manager, hired 2 years earlier, a year before any of this started, according to the personnel file date, a detail that would later matter enormously, because it meant this was not some sudden midlife crisis conjured out of nowhere during my father's illness. It meant Grant had worked alongside this woman for a full year before whatever this was began, and it meant the timeline I would eventually need to reconstruct was longer and colder, and far more deliberate than a grieving husband losing his footing during a hard season. I want to stop here and tell you about the week that followed, because it is the week I made the decision that shaped everything else in this story. And I think it's important for anyone listening to this who is standing at a similar crossroads to understand that the decision did not feel brave or strategic in the moment. It felt like survival. My father had, 3 weeks earlier, started his second round of chemotherapy, the harder round, the one Dr. Anand had warned us would cost him most of his remaining good days in exchange for buying more of them, and I remember sitting at his kitchen table on Sycamore Street that Tuesday, watching him try to eat a piece of toast he didn't want, and understanding with total clarity that I did not have the emotional or logistical bandwidth that month to also blow up my marriage. Not because I was willing to stay with a man who was cheating on me. I want to be completely clear about that then and now. But because I understood, sitting at that table, that whatever I did next needed to happen on a timeline I controlled, not a timeline dictated by the worst month of my father's illness, and not a timeline dictated by catching Grant off guard in a moment of raw emotion I would regret managing badly. So I made a decision that I know, from the handful of friends I eventually told the full story to, sounds cold to some people when they first hear it described. I decided I was not going to confront Grant yet. I decided I was going to find out everything there was to find out, quietly, patiently, methodically, the way my father would have traced a wiring fault before I said a single word, and I decided that while I was finding it out, I was also going to build, piece by piece, an entire separate structure for my own life and my children's lives that did not depend on Grant Colston for a single thing, so that whenever the moment came that I chose to speak, or whenever Grant did something reckless enough to force the moment early, I would already be standing on ground that was entirely, unshakably mine. The first call I made was to my best friend, Patty Farrow, not because I needed advice yet, but because I needed one single person in the world who knew what was actually happening in my house. And Patty had been that person for me since we were 9 years old, and she moved into the house 2 doors down from my father's on Sycamore Street. Patty works behind the counter at the Ashwood Falls Pharmacy, has for 20 years, and she is the kind of friend who, when I sat in her kitchen on a Wednesday night in early September and told her everything, the hotel charges, the phone in the truck, The message from VC did not gasp or cry or tell me what I should do. She listened to the entire thing, refilled my coffee once, and then said, "Okay, what do you need from me?" Which is exactly the question I needed someone to ask because it let me start answering it out loud for the first time. What I needed from Patty in that first conversation was simple and specific. I needed a mailing address that was not my own house because I understood with the same clear-eyed practicality that had kept me from throwing that cracked phone at Grant's head that anything I did to protect myself financially was going to generate paper, statements, letters, documents, and none of it could arrive at a house where Grant collected the mail from the box at the end of our driveway most evenings out of long habit. Patty said yes before I even finished the sentence, and for the next 14 months, a growing folder of documents that would eventually change the entire shape of my life sat in a fireproof lockbox in the back of Patty Farrow's linen closet, 2 streets from where I grew up, completely invisible to a husband who had no reason to ever look there. The second thing I did, within that same week, was open an account at the Green Mountain Credit Union in Bramfield, the next town over. 18 miles from Ashwood Falls, the same town, I noted, with a grim kind of irony I didn't share with the teller, where the Bramfield Inn and Suites sat with its own growing collection of charges on my joint credit card statement. I opened it in my name only, using money I had genuine legal and moral claim to without question. A small inheritance of $11,000 my mother had left me 11 years earlier when she died. Money I had kept in a separate account, my entire marriage not out of foresight about Grant specifically, but simply because it had felt, since the day I received it, like the last physical piece of my mother, and I had never wanted to fold it into anything that could be divided, spent, or argued over. That $11,000 became the seed of everything else. I had statements mailed to Patty's address. I told the credit union to skip paper confirmations for anything that could go digital, and I set up the online access using a new email address Grant had never seen, one I checked only from my phone, on data, never on the home Wi-Fi network that Grant, being the practical, tech-comfortable owner of a restoration business with a company network, had set up and occasionally monitored for bandwidth issues. Another detail that mattered more than I realized at the time. Over the following months, I moved a portion of my own paycheck into that account. I want to be precise here, because this detail gets exaggerated in the retelling sometimes when I've described it to other people, and precision matters to me. I did not drain our joint accounts. I did not do anything that would have been visible to Grant on a shared statement, because a joint account behaving strangely is the single fastest way to tip your hand to a spouse who is, whatever else he was doing, still an intelligent man who ran the financial side of a 31-employee company. What I did was far quieter. I am the office manager and head bookkeeper at the Ashwood Falls Regional Medical Clinic, a job I've held for 14 years, and I redirected 40% of my own direct deposit into the new Bramfield account, while continuing to pay every household bill exactly as I always had out of the 60% that still landed in our joint checking, which meant that to Grant, glancing at a joint balance that looked more or less the way it always looked, absolutely nothing appeared to have changed. Over 14 months, that quiet 40%, plus my mother's $11,000, plus a small bonus the clinic paid me in December that I did not mention to Grant at all, grew into just over $26,000, sitting in an account he did not know existed, in a town 18 miles away, under a name and email address he had never once had reason to search for. The third thing I did, and this is the one that I think, looking back, actually mattered the most, was call a divorce attorney, not to file anything yet, but to understand exactly what I was standing on before I took another step. I found Diane Ostrander through a coworker at the clinic, a nurse named Colleen who had gone through her own difficult divorce 2 years earlier and had nothing but respect for the woman who'd represented her, a family law attorney with an office in Montpelier, 40 minutes from Ashwood Falls, far enough that I was never going to run into anyone from town in her waiting room. I drove there on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-September, telling Grant I had a dentist appointment, which required its own small, quiet lie that I did not enjoy telling, but which I understood by then was simply the price of admission to protecting myself in a marriage where the other party had stopped extending me the same honesty a long time before I had any evidence of it. Diane Ostrander is a small, precise woman in her 50s with reading glasses she wears low on her nose and a way of asking questions that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like I was talking to someone who had seen this exact situation many times before and was not going to be shocked or destabilized by any part of it, which was exactly what I needed. I told her everything: the hotel charges, the phone, the message, the 1-year gap between Vanessa Cole's hire date and whatever this had become. Diane listened, took careful notes, and then told me something that reshaped how I thought about the entire next year of my life. She said, "Rachel, the biggest mistake I see women make in your exact situation is moving too fast out of anger or too slow out of fear. And you have the rare advantage right now of having discovered this before your husband knows you've discovered it, which means every single thing you do from this point forward can be deliberate instead of reactive. Use that advantage. It does not last forever, but you have it right now." What Diane laid out for me in that first meeting and several that followed over the coming months became the actual blueprint for the 14 months I'm describing to you. Vermont is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, which meant that Colston Restoration, despite existing entirely in Grant's name, was very likely a marital asset subject to division, since it had been built and grown almost entirely during our marriage. But proving its true value, especially if Grant had any inclination to understate it once he knew a divorce was coming, was going to require a forensic accountant, not just a lawyer, someone who could look at the actual books, the actual contracts, the actual cash flow of a construction and restoration business, and produce a number a judge would trust over whatever number Grant's own accountant might eventually produce. Diane introduced me in October to Sharon Whitcomb, a forensic financial analyst she had worked with on a dozen prior cases. A calm, thorough woman who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet, preemptive documentation. I want to explain something about why I was willing to spend money, real money, out of my own separate funds, on a forensic accountant before I had even told my husband I knew about the affair. And it goes back to something Diane said to me in that first meeting that I have never forgotten. She said, "The businesses that get undervalued in a divorce are never the ones where the wife waited until the papers were filed to start asking questions. They're the ones where the husband had 8 or 9 months of advance warning to quietly move contracts, delay invoicing, reclassify personal expenses as business expenses, and generally make the company look smaller and less profitable than it actually is, right before the valuation date." I had, at that point, no idea whether Grant would ever do something like that. I did not think of him, even then, even furious as I privately was, as a fundamentally dishonest businessman. But I understood that I could not afford to guess wrong about that, not with my children's future resting on the answer. And so Sharon Whitcomb spent the better part of 5 months quietly, working from copies of financial documents I was able to access through my own limited bookkeeping role, and through records Diane was able to obtain through entirely proper channels, building a clean, defensible, contemporaneous valuation of Colston Restoration as it actually existed in the months before Grant had any reason to start hiding anything. While Sharon Whitcomb worked quietly on the business valuation through the fall, I was doing my own parallel work, the part that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with proof, because Diane had been very clear with me early on that in an equitable distribution state, the specific fact of adultery does not automatically change how assets get divided. Vermont doesn't punish a cheating spouse financially just for cheating, but it can matter enormously for how a judge views credibility, how a custody arrangement gets shaped if things turn contentious, and, practically speaking, for my own ability to negotiate from a position of documented fact instead of he said, she said. I wanted the truth cataloged in a way that could not be argued with later, not because I intended to humiliate Grant with it, but because I had learned enough by September about how ugly divorces can get when one party feels cornered, to know that I might eventually need it. I started keeping a written log, Dated entries in a plain composition notebook I bought at the pharmacy from Patty herself, who rang me up without a single question in her eyes, even though I'm certain she understood exactly what it was for. Every hotel charge I found on the joint statement, I wrote down the date, the amount, and what Grant had told me he was doing that night, side by side, so the contradiction was documented in real time rather than reconstructed from memory months later. I found 6 more charges at the Bramfield Inn and Suites between September and the following March, each one logged the same way. I also began carefully forwarding certain things to myself. Our family used a shared cloud photo account, set up years earlier so photos from both of our phones would back up to the same place for the kids' school projects and holiday cards. And Grant, for reasons I will never fully understand except that people who believe they're invisible get careless, occasionally took photos that synced automatically to that shared account before he thought to delete them. A hotel key card sitting on a nightstand, a woman's hand, unmistakably not mine, resting on a restaurant table next to his. I did not go looking for these constantly, and I want to be honest that finding them was one of the very few moments in this entire process where my careful, methodical composure genuinely cracked. Alone in my car, in the clinic parking lot at lunch, looking at a photograph of my husband's hand next to a stranger's. But each time it happened, I saved the image to a private folder on my own phone, and later that week, printed it at the library on Elm Street, using the public computer, not our home printer, and added it to the growing file in Patty's linen closet. By November, 7 months after my father's diagnosis and 3 months after I'd found that first hotel charge, I had a name to put fully to the shape in the photographs. I confirmed, through a combination of the staff directory, a company holiday party photo Grant hadn't realized was posted publicly on the Colston Restoration social media page, and a conversation with a woman named Denise who did the office payroll and who mentioned, entirely innocently, over coffee at a school fundraiser, that Vanessa Cole had transferred to the Ashwood Falls office from a Colston Restoration satellite office in Rutland almost exactly 2 years earlier. That the woman in the photographs, the woman texting my husband about Thursdays and asking him to come by after Ned left, was without any remaining doubt Vanessa Cole, 33 years old, senior accounts manager, a woman I realized with a strange, distant nausea, actually met twice myself, once at the company Christmas party and once at the summer picnic 2 years running, had made pleasant small talk with about nothing in particular. Had no reason at either time to look at twice. The math on when this actually started came together slowly, and it is, I think, the single detail in this entire story that changed how I felt about Grant, most permanently, more than any hotel receipt. I had assumed in my first weeks of quiet investigation that whatever this was had begun sometime after my father's diagnosis in April, that it was some kind of grief-adjacent failure of character in a man buckling under the strain of watching his father-in-law get sick, which would not have excused it, but would have at least explained it as a specific, bounded weakness, rather than a fixed feature of who he was. Sharon Whitcomb's financial tracing told a different story, a pattern of unexplained cash withdrawals and small, easily missed personal charges routed through a Colston Restoration expense account, the kind of thing that looks, if you're not looking closely, like ordinary business entertainment spending, started not in April and not in July, but the previous December, 4 full months before my father was ever diagnosed with anything. Whatever this was between Grant and Vanessa Cole, it had not been born out of the particular grief of that specific year. It had already been alive for 4 months before my father got sick at all, which meant every single one of Grant's careful, rehearsed acts of supportive husband performance during my father's illness had been exactly that, a performance laid deliberately on top of something that was already happening. Not a good man cracking under pressure, but a man already living a double life who had simply gotten better at hiding it once there was a sympathetic, convenient explanation. A sick father-in-law sitting right there for anyone who noticed his absences to reach for. I told Diane Ostrander about the December start date in our November meeting, and I remember she set down her pen for a moment, which she rarely did, and said, "Rachel, I want you to sit with that fact for a second before we keep going. because I think it's going to matter to you later whether you decided this while you were still angry or after you'd had time to actually feel it. She was right to make me sit with it. It changed something in me. Quietly over the following weeks, some remaining soft hope I hadn't even fully admitted to myself I was still carrying. The hope that this was a mistake made by a good man in a hard season, rather than a choice made by a man who was, underneath the version of himself I'd married, willing to build an entire second life in careful parallel to the first one. Once that hope was gone, the work got easier, in a strange way. I stopped waiting for some explanation that would make sense of it. I just kept building. In December, alongside the ongoing valuation work and my own quiet documentation, I made 2 changes that Diane specifically recommended, and both of them, I want to be honest, felt at the time like small, private acts of self-preservation, and only later did I understand how much they actually mattered. I changed the beneficiary on my 403(b) retirement account through the clinic, which had listed Grant as primary beneficiary since we opened it, to Emma and Tyler in equal shares, with my brother Danny named as trustee to manage any funds until they turned 25, in the event anything ever happened to me. I did the same with a small-term life insurance policy I'd carried since Tyler was born, $25,000, not a fortune, but mine to redirect, and I redirected it the same way. I did not do this dramatically or angrily. I did it on a Tuesday lunch break at the clinic's HR office, filled out 2 forms, and drove back to my desk 15 minutes later. And if you had asked me in that moment what I was feeling, I think the honest answer is that I felt, for the first time in months, like I was doing something rather than simply absorbing something, which is a feeling I had been starving for since August. The second thing I did in December, at Diane's suggestion, was gather and secure copies of every document that would matter enormously in the event things moved quickly or badly. Emma and Tyler's birth certificates and social security cards, which I photographed and also physically copied at the library, the originals of which stayed exactly where they'd always been in our fireproof home safe, so nothing would look disturbed, but copies of which now lived in Patty's linen closet alongside my growing folder, our joint tax returns for the past 5 years, the mortgage documents for the house on Birchwood Lane, which we'd bought 9 years earlier and which was, I already knew from Diane, likely to become the single most emotionally significant piece of property in whatever came next, because it was the only home Emma and Tyler had ever really known, Emma having been 5 and Tyler 2 when we moved in. I photographed the contents of our joint safe deposit box at the Ashwood Falls Savings Bank on a Saturday morning when Grant took the kids to a hockey tournament in Barra, an afternoon that gave me almost 4 uninterrupted hours, more time than I actually needed, to methodically photograph every document in that box and return each one to its exact original position, down to which way each folded paper was creased. I want to pause here and say something about what this period of my life actually felt like from the inside, because I think it would be dishonest to describe it only as cold competence, as though I moved through those months as some kind of unfeeling machine executing a plan. I did not. I cried in my car more times than I can count, usually in the clinic parking lot during my lunch hour, usually after finding some new small piece of evidence, a text preview, a receipt, a photograph. I lay awake most nights next to a man I still, in some complicated, diminishing way, loved, or at least loved the 17 years of memory attached to, watching him sleep with the specific, peaceful ignorance of a person who believes he is getting away with something. And some nights that peace made me want to shake him awake and scream every fact I'd gathered directly into his face. I did not do that. I want to be honest about how much active, daily discipline it took not to do that, because I think people sometimes hear a story like mine and imagine the woman at the center of it as naturally cold, naturally patient, when the truth is I was neither of those things by temperament. I was simply more afraid every single day of what would happen to my children if I moved too soon and badly than I was of what it cost me, privately, to keep moving slowly and well. In January, 5 months into what I'd started privately calling, only inside my own head, the quiet part, I did something that felt almost absurdly small compared to everything else, but which ended up mattering more than I expected. We'd been talking, Grant and I, for almost 2 years before any of this started, about replacing the ancient doorbell on the house on Birchwood Lane with one of the video doorbell systems everyone else on our street already had, mostly because we'd had 2 packages stolen off the porch the Christmas before, and Grant had always been the one who said he'd get around to it and never did, which was, in fairness to him, genuinely in character. He was a details-later kind of man about anything that wasn't directly related to the business. In January, on a day Grant was at a supplier conference in Manchester, New Hampshire, a conference I would later learn, through Sharon Whitcomb's careful tracing of expense reports, had no actual registration record anywhere, no hotel folio matching the dates he'd claimed, nothing except a fabricated line item on his own expense account. I installed the video doorbell myself, a task that took 40 minutes and a YouTube tutorial, and set the notifications to go only to my phone, explaining to Grant afterward when he asked that I'd finally just done it myself out of frustration, which had the added benefit of being completely true. I did not install that doorbell to catch Grant meeting Vanessa at our own home. That thought had not fully occurred to me, and I want to be honest that when it did happen, twice over the following months, it was one of the very few times my composure genuinely failed me in a way I couldn't immediately recover from. The first time was in February, a Wednesday afternoon when I was at the clinic and the kids were both still at school, and my phone buzzed with a doorbell notification I almost ignored, assuming it was a delivery, and instead showed Vanessa Cole standing on my own front porch, glancing over her shoulder in a way that told me, even through a small phone screen, that she knew exactly how she'd feel if someone saw her there. And a few seconds later, footage of my own front door opening from the inside, meaning Grant was home in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon when he'd told me he was at a job site, walked through in St. Albans, and had let her in. I sat in the clinic break room, the footage looping on my phone, and I felt something in me go past cold into something closer to numb. The specific numbness of watching a thing you already knew, intellectually, become a thing you were now watching happen in real time, in the kitchen where I made my children's breakfast every morning, in a house with Emma's height marks penciled onto the doorframe of the hall closet, a detail I think about often, that particular doorframe, because it is the single image from this entire year that still catches in my throat, sometimes even now, 18 months later. I saved that footage the same night, transferred it to a private cloud folder under the new email address, and printed still frames at the library the following Saturday. And I told exactly no one about it except Diane in our next scheduled call, because I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me in the moment, that this was no longer only evidence of infidelity in the abstract legal sense Diane had described. This was evidence that Grant was willing to bring another woman into the home where our children slept during hours he knew they would be at school, a fact that mattered enormously, Diane told me, gently but directly, for how a judge would eventually view questions of judgment and parenting if custody ever became a contested issue, which, given everything else, I now had to assume it might. Diane raised, in that same February call, the idea of a postnuptial agreement, a legal document that could, in theory, formalize a more protective financial arrangement for me going forward without requiring me to file for divorce yet. And she was careful to frame it honestly, telling me that raising it with Grant now carried real risk, because it would very likely tip him off that something had shifted in how I saw our marriage. Even if I gave him a plausible cover story for why I was suddenly interested in something like that, I thought about it for 2 weeks. In the end, I decided to try, carefully, framing it to Grant one evening in early March as something I'd been thinking about after watching my own father's estate get complicated by not having clear paperwork in place. A story that had the benefit of being emotionally true, even if it wasn't my real motive. And I watched my husband's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. A flicker of something that was not confusion and was not offense, but was, unmistakably, calculation. Before he said, in a slightly too careful voice, that he didn't see why we needed something like that after 17 years, that it felt like planning for failure, and changed the subject within 90 seconds to ask whether Tyler's practice had been moved to the earlier time slot. I did not push it further that night, but I understood something important from that 90 seconds, something I reported back to Diane almost word for word in our next call. A man with nothing to hide asked calmly about formalizing financial protections after 17 years of marriage, generally responds with some mixture of amusement and mild irritation at the paperwork. A man who is actively living a double life he does not yet know has been discovered, responds with a very specific, controlled kind of deflection. The sound of someone doing rapid math about what a question like that might mean, and Grant's 90 seconds of deflection told me, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire process, that on some level, even without knowing I had proof, some part of him already understood that the ground under his own marriage had shifted, even if he had no idea yet that I was the one who had shifted it. My father's decline accelerated through the spring, the following spring, roughly a year after his diagnosis, and I want to tell you about that period honestly, because it is the part of this story where the two halves of my life, the grieving daughter and the quietly self-protecting wife, were running at exactly the same time, in the same body, and I am still not entirely sure how I managed both without one of them breaking the other. Dr. Anand told us in March that the chemotherapy had stopped meaningfully slowing the disease, and that we were moving into a season of managing my father's comfort rather than managing his cancer, language that everyone in that small exam room understood perfectly even though nobody said the actual word out loud until my father himself said it, looking directly at Dr. Anand and asking plainly how long, and Dr. Anand, to his credit, did not soften it more than the truth allowed. Months, he said, not years. I increased my visits to my father's house on Sycamore Street to 5, sometimes 6 mornings a week that spring, and Danny started driving down from Burlington most weekends instead of every other weekend, and my father, even as his body failed him in increasingly visible ways, remained sharp enough, right up until close to the end, to notice things about the people around him that he chose, for reasons I understand better now than I did then, not to say anything about for a long time. It was Danny who first told me, in April, that Dad had asked him, out of nowhere, sitting on the back porch on a Saturday afternoon while I was inside doing dishes, whether everything was all right between Grant and me because he'd noticed I seemed thinner and quieter and that I flinched, his word flinched, when my phone buzzed during visits in a way I never used to. Danny told me this carefully, watching my face, and I told him, in that moment, a version of the truth that was not the whole truth, that things were stressful with Dad being sick and the kids' schedules and Grant's business being busy. All true. None of it the actual answer. And Danny, who loved me and who had 2 hours of highway between himself and the daily texture of my life, accepted that answer because he had no reason not to, and because I did not want my father spending whatever months he had left worrying about my marriage on top of everything else his body was already taking from him. I want to tell you about one specific afternoon in April, though, because I think about it often, more than almost any other single memory from that year. I was sitting with my father on his back porch, the same porch Danny had mentioned, and he reached over and took my hand, his grip weaker than it used to be, but still unmistakably his particular grip. And he said, without any preamble at all, "Rachel, whatever's going on, you don't have to fix it for my sake. I'm not so sick that I need you to pretend things are fine." I have never been sure to this day whether my father knew something specific, whether he had seen something, heard something in town the way small towns eventually let almost everything slip, or whether he simply knew his own daughter well enough after 42 years to read the specific quality of my exhaustion and correctly guess that it wasn't only about him. I told him that afternoon that everything was fine, and he looked at me for a long moment with an expression I can only describe as patient disbelief, and then let it go and squeezed my hand once and asked if I'd brought the crossword. The second time Vanessa Cole came to my own house happened in June, 4 months after the first doorbell notification, and this time I was not at work when it happened. I was upstairs, home early with a migraine, car in the shop, which Grant did not know because I had walked the 1.5 miles home from the clinic rather than call him for a ride. A small, almost accidental piece of bad luck for him that turned into the single most important piece of evidence I gathered in the entire 14 months. I heard the front door, assumed it was Grant coming home for something, and came halfway down the stairs before I heard a second voice, a woman's voice, and stopped, out of sight, at the turn of the staircase, and listened to my husband and Vanessa Cole talk in my own kitchen for 11 minutes, close enough to hear almost every word, close enough that when I quietly took out my phone and began recording audio, my hands were shaking so badly I had to brace my arm against the banister to hold it steady. I'm going to tell you what I heard, as close to word for word as I can, because I have listened to that recording enough times, transcribed it enough times for Diane's file, that it is burned into me with a permanence most memories don't have. Vanessa's voice, first, tight and a little frightened in a way that told me she was not a woman entirely comfortable with what she was doing, which surprised me in a strange way, more than almost anything else. Some small, ungenerous part of me had built her, in my head, into someone purely predatory, and hearing actual fear in her voice complicated that picture in ways I did not want complicated. She said, "Grant, we can't keep doing this here. This is insane. What if Rachel comes home?" And Grant's voice, calm, almost bored, the voice he used for closing a difficult client on the phone, saying, "She won't. She's at the clinic until 5. She's like clockwork. You worry too much." I remember the specific small violence of that phrase. "She's like clockwork," said about me, about my entire life's predictable rhythm, used as a piece of operational intelligence in an affair. And I remember understanding, hearing it, that whatever affection Grant still performed toward me at home had, at some point I could not pinpoint, curdled into something closer to management, a schedule to be worked around rather than a person to be honored. The conversation went on. Vanessa asked, at one point, voice smaller, whether Grant was ever going to actually leave, and Grant did not answer that question directly, which told me almost as much as an answer would have, said instead something about how complicated things were right now with Walter being sick, that he couldn't do anything that would upset Rachel while her father was dying, that it would make him look like a monster, phrasing that I sat with for a long time afterward, because it revealed, more clearly than anything else in that recording, that Grant's continued restraint had nothing to do with any residual loyalty to me or our marriage, and everything to do with careful, ongoing management of his own public image in a small town where being the man who left his wife while her father was dying of cancer would have cost him something socially and professionally that he was not willing to pay. My father's illness was not, to Grant, a tragedy happening to people he loved. It was a scheduling constraint on his own plans, a piece of optics he needed to manage until the timing was more convenient for him. I sent that recording to myself the same afternoon, added a transcript to the file in Patty's linen closet within 2 days, and told Diane about it in detail in our next call. And I remember her saying, quietly, "Rachel, I want you to understand that what you just described, him citing your father's illness as the reason he can't leave you yet, that's not restraint. That's timeline management. And I think some part of you already knows that. And I did know it. And hearing her say it out loud in her calm, unshockable voice made something in me settle in a way I badly needed that month. I stopped waiting after that recording for any version of Grant to reveal himself as fundamentally decent underneath all of this. I understood fully for the first time that the man managing his mistress's fear around my supposedly clockwork schedule and calculating the social cost of leaving a dying man's daughter was not a temporary aberration from my husband's character. It was, simply, accurately, who he actually was, and had perhaps always been capable of being, underneath 17 years of a performance I had never had reason to doubt before. By that point, June, 10 months into the quiet part, Sharon Whitcomb had completed her valuation of Colston Restoration, placing the company's fair market value at just under $2.1 million. With roughly 70% of that value having accrued during the years of our marriage, and therefore squarely marital property under Vermont law, a number Diane told me was both higher than Grant would likely claim, if asked casually, and defensible enough to hold up under a judge's scrutiny if Grant's own accountant tried to argue it down later. Diane had also, by June, drafted a full divorce petition, complete with a proposed parenting plan that gave me primary physical custody of Emma and Tyler, with generous structured visitation for Grant, a document that sat, printed and signed, where required, in a folder in her Montpelier office, ready to be filed within 24 hours of my instruction, whenever that instruction came. I did not yet know, in June, that the instruction would come 4 months later, in a chapel, in front of 200 mourners, at my own father's funeral. I only knew that I was, for the first time since April of the previous year, actually ready, in every practical sense that mattered, for whatever happened next, whenever it happened. The summer passed in the strange, suspended way that summers do when you are watching someone you love die slowly, while also quietly dismantling your own marriage in secret, both processes moving at their own pace, both requiring a version of me that could show up steady and present for my children's entire school break, for Tyler's baseball tournament in July that Grant coached from the sideline with Vanessa Cole. I now knew, watching from her own car in the parking lot on at least one occasion, careful never to sit in the bleachers where anyone might ask who she was. My father moved into a hospital bed set up in his own living room on Sycamore Street in August, a year and 4 months after his diagnosis, arranged by a hospice team that Danny and I coordinated together over a series of phone calls that were, in their own way, some of the closest and most honest conversations my brother and I have ever had. Two adults finally speaking to each other as equals, instead of as the older sister who stayed and the younger brother who left, both of us finally just scared, together, about the same thing. I told Danny the truth about Grant in September, 4 weeks before our father died, not because anything had changed in my plan, but because I needed, badly, at least one member of my own family to know what I was carrying. And because I was starting to understand that Danny would need to know eventually anyway, given how everything was likely to unfold, and I would rather he heard it from me, calmly, in a kitchen, than pieced it together later, from town gossip or from watching it happen in real time at a funeral, though in the end, painfully, both things happened anyway. Danny's reaction was not calm. My brother, who I have described to you as quiet, gentle, a man who moved 2 hours away and mostly avoided confrontation his entire adult life, stood up from my kitchen table so fast his chair nearly tipped over, and I watched a version of him I had genuinely never seen before, jaw tight, hands actually shaking, ask me in a voice I didn't recognize, "How long, Rachel? How long have you known?" And when I told him 14, at that point, almost 15 months, something in his face went through several stages of a grief I hadn't fully anticipated. Grief not only for me, but for the version of our family, the version where Grant Colston was simply his brother-in-law who taught his nephew to fish, that he now understood had already been a lie for over a year. I made Danny promise that night not to say anything to our father, and this was, I think, the hardest thing I asked of anyone during that entire period, harder even than what I eventually asked of myself. My father had, at that point, 6 or 7 weeks left, though none of us knew the number precisely yet, and I could not and would not let his last weeks on earth be spent worrying about the marriage of his only daughter, could not let one of his final clear-headed conversations with Danny or with me be about Grant's affair, instead of about the things that actually mattered in a life running out of time, old stories, old jokes, the specific way he wanted his tools distributed among Danny's kids and mine, a conversation he insisted on having with startling calm on a Tuesday afternoon in September, listing off, item by item, which grandchild should get which piece from his workshop, the level, the good drill, the router table he'd built himself, Tyler's name attached to more of them than anyone else's, a fact Tyler still doesn't fully understand the weight of. My father, Walter Doyle, died on the 4th Thursday of October, 18 months to the week after his diagnosis, at 4 a.m, in the hospital bed in his own living room, with Danny and me both there, having taken shifts through that final week, so neither of us would be alone with him if it happened in the night, which it did. I want to tell you that in that room, in that specific hour, none of the 14 months of Grant and Vanessa existed at all for me. My father's hand went slack in mine, sometime between one breath and the next, one that never came, and Danny made a sound I had never heard a grown man make. And the hospice nurse, a kind, tired woman named Marguerite, who had sat with more families in that exact moment than either of us could imagine, quietly stepped out to give us those first minutes alone, and I sat there holding my father's hand in a house that smelled like his coffee and his old flannel shirts, and grief, real grief, uncomplicated by anything else in my life, simply arrived and took up all the space there was. The week between my father's death and his funeral is, to this day, mostly a blur of logistics, the specific merciful numbness that arranging a funeral gives you, choosing a casket at Kowalski and Sons Funeral Home on Main Street, the same funeral home that had buried my mother 11 years earlier, writing an obituary that tried and failed to compress 41 years of wiring the entire town of Ashwood Falls into 400 words, calling relatives, confirming with Reverend Paul Ashby, who had known me since I was a girl in his Sunday school class and who would officiate the same way he'd officiated my mother's funeral and, 17 years before that, my own wedding. A detail neither of us mentioned out loud that week, but which sat quietly between us anyway. Grant, through all of it, was present in the specific way he'd been present for most of the previous 18 months, saying all the correct things, handling the flowers, standing next to me at the funeral home making decisions about programs and music, and I noticed, watching him do it, that I felt almost nothing anymore when he touched my shoulder or told me he loved me, a strange, hollow absence, where 17 years of feeling should have been, replaced by something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but a kind of exhausted clarity, the sense of watching a man perform a role in a play whose ending I already knew, and he did not. I arranged, that week, for Emma and Tyler to have a sleepover at Patty's house the night after the funeral, telling them it was so I could have some quiet time to grieve, which was true, though it was also, I will admit now, a piece of foresight I'd built in deliberately, because some instinct I couldn't fully name that week told me I might need my children somewhere safe and happy, and utterly unaware if the day of the funeral went the way some smaller, colder part of me was already beginning to suspect it might go, given how Grant had been behaving in the days beforehand, distracted in a specific way, taking calls outside on the porch that he hadn't taken outside a year earlier, a small tell I recognize now the way you recognize a smell you've learned to associate with something bad. The morning of the funeral, a Tuesday in late October, cold and bright, the specific hard blue sky Vermont gets after the leaves have mostly turned and fallen. I drove myself and the kids to the chapel early, an hour early, because I wanted time to sit with my father's casket before the room filled with people. Wanted a few private minutes that belonged only to Danny and me and our children, a request Reverend Ashby had arranged without my even having to ask twice. Grant told me that morning that he needed to stop by the office first to handle something urgent with a client, that he'd meet us at the chapel, and I remember looking at him in our kitchen in his good navy suit and feeling a very specific, quiet certainty settle into my chest, not suspicion exactly, because I already knew everything there was to know by then, but something closer to a held breath, the sense of standing at the very last minute of a very long, very careful year, waiting to see what shape the ending would actually take. I sat in the third row of the Ashwood Falls Community Chapel with Emma on one side of me and Tyler on the other, my brother Danny and his wife on the row behind us, 200 people filling in around us, the mayor, half the volunteer fire department my father had helped run fundraisers for, teachers who'd had Emma or Tyler in class, neighbors from Sycamore Street who'd known my father their whole lives, and I listened to Reverend Ashby begin his opening remarks, describing my father as a man who fixed what was broken without ever asking to be thanked for it, and I remember thinking, in that specific moment, how strange it was that the sentence was true of my father in every sense, except the one that mattered most right now, because I was the one, this year, who had quietly fixed what was broken in my own life, and I had done it without asking anyone to thank me either, and I did not yet know that within the hour, my husband was going to walk through that side door and make sure the entire town found out anyway. Reverend Ashby was 7 minutes into his opening remarks, describing a story about my father rewiring the entire Ashwood Falls Elementary School gymnasium for free one summer after a storm knocked out the original system, a story most of the room already knew and loved, hearing again anyway, when I heard the side door of the chapel creak open, the specific creak I'd heard my entire life at that chapel, at my own wedding, at my mother's funeral, and I turned. The way you turn toward any sound in a room that quiet. And there was Grant, 40 minutes late in his good Navy suit and on his arm, unmistakably, in a black dress a shade too fitted and a shade too short for a funeral, was Vanessa Cole. I want to describe the physical sensation of that moment as precisely as I can, because I have been asked about it many times since, by Patty, by Diane, by my own therapist in the months that followed, and the honest answer surprises people every time I give it. I did not feel shock. Shock requires an element of surprise, and I had known about Vanessa Cole for 14 months by that point, had listened to a recording of her voice in my own kitchen, had watched her walk up my own front porch on a doorbell camera twice. What I felt, watching Grant walk her down the side aisle of my father's funeral, was something closer to recognition. The specific, almost clarifying recognition of watching a thing you always suspected a person was capable of finally happen in full view of everyone, in the one setting where it could do the most damage to the fewest people who deserved it. My father's funeral in front of 200 mourners, many of whom, I would learn within the hour, had no idea who Vanessa Cole even was, and several of whom, the ones from Colston Restoration, understood immediately and with visible horror exactly what they were looking at. Grant did not seat her with the family. I will give him that much, though I am not sure it was decency so much as a final flicker of self-preservation, some instinct that even he understood a line existed that he had not quite crossed yet. He walked her to the fourth row on the opposite side of the aisle from Danny's family, and I watched him lean down and murmur something to her before straightening and making his way up to the front, to the empty seat beside me that had been waiting for him since we walked in, an hour earlier, sitting empty in a way that every single person in that chapel had clearly already noticed and quietly wondered about. He sat down next to me, adjusted his jacket, and whispered close to my ear, in the exact tone of a man delivering an entirely reasonable explanation, that Vanessa had insisted on coming to pay her respects, that she'd met Walter at the company's summer picnics a couple of times, that it would have been rude to tell her not to come. I did not answer him. I want to be honest that in that specific moment, with Reverend Ashby still speaking, with my father's casket 10 feet in front of me, with Emma's hand in mine and Tyler's hand in my other one, I made a decision, in about 2 seconds, that shaped everything that happened for the rest of that day. I decided that my father's funeral was not going to become the site of my confrontation with Grant Colston, not because Grant deserved that mercy, but because my father did, because 200 people had come to grieve a man who deserved a service about his own life, not a spectacle about his son-in-law's affair, and because Emma and Tyler, sitting on either side of me, deserved to bury their grandfather without their mother's marriage detonating in the same hour. So I sat there. I did not turn to look at Vanessa Cole again. I kept my eyes on the casket and on Reverend Ashby, and I held my children's hands, and some old, tired, disciplined part of me that had spent 14 months building exactly this kind of composure simply took over and got me through the rest of that service, dry-eyed in front of the town, though I want you to know it was not because I felt nothing. It was because I had spent 14 months learning exactly how to feel everything and still keep my hands steady. Near the end of the service, during the closing hymn, Amazing Grace, the same hymn that had been sung at my mother's funeral 11 years earlier, Grant reached over and took my hand, an old habit 17 years deep, the automatic gesture of a husband reaching for his wife's hand during a hard moment, and I let him take it for exactly the length of one verse, some part of me needing, even then, one last small confirmation of what 17 years had actually felt like before I closed the door on it permanently. And then, quietly, without any drama at all, I withdrew my hand from his and folded both of mine in my lap for the rest of the hymn. Grant glanced at me, confused, and I looked straight ahead at my father's casket and did not look back at him. And I understood, in that exact wordless moment, that I had just marked the actual end of my marriage, privately, silently in a pew, in a way that meant infinitely more to me than anything I would say to him later that night, because it happened entirely on my own terms, in my own time, the way almost nothing else about that year had been allowed to happen. The reception was held in the fellowship hall behind the chapel, the same low-ceilinged room with the same folding tables that has hosted every funeral reception in Ashwood Falls for as long as I can remember. Casseroles and sheet cakes brought by women from the church who have been quietly feeding grieving families in this town for decades. And I want to tell you that the hardest part of that entire day was not Grant walking in with Vanessa. It was the specific, careful way the room managed the fact of her presence for the following 90 minutes, the way conversations dipped and rerouted whenever Vanessa drifted near a cluster of people, the way Sandra Whitfield, whose son played third base with Tyler, physically stepped in front of me at one point to redirect my path so I wouldn't end up standing next to her at the coffee urn, an act of pure small-town protective instinct that I will be grateful for as long as I live. Vanessa did not stay long. She left within the hour, alone, walking to her own car in the parking lot, and I watched Ned Colston, Grant's own brother, watch her go with an expression on his face that told me, even then, before anyone had said a single word to him about any of it, that some part of Ned already understood exactly what he was looking at, a suspicion that would be confirmed for him in full within the week and would end, eventually, with consequences of his own making that had nothing to do with me. My father's oldest friend, a man named Roy Castell, who had worked alongside him at the electrical company for 30 years, found me by the dessert table and said, without any particular tact, "Because Roy has never had much use for tact, Rachel, your dad would have had that fella out on the sidewalk by his collar inside of 10 seconds. And I laughed, actually laughed, a real laugh, the first one in longer than I could remember, because it was true. And because Roy had known my father well enough to know exactly what he would have done. And there was something enormously comforting in the middle of the worst day of that entire year in being reminded so plainly of exactly who my father had been. Grant found me near the end of the reception, once most people had started filtering out, and asked, quietly, if I was ready to go home, and I said yes, and we drove home together, separately from the kids who Patty had already collected for their planned sleepover, in a silence that Grant seemed to interpret as grief, and that was, in fact, something closer to the last few minutes of a held breath I'd been holding for 14 months. We got home to the house on Birchwood Lane a little after 4 in the afternoon, the light already starting to go long and gold the way it does in late October, and Grant went to change out of his suit, and I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd first found that hotel charge on a credit card statement 14 months earlier, and waited for him to come back downstairs, because I had decided, somewhere between the third row of that chapel and the fellowship hall coffee urn, that today, finally, on my own terms, was the day. Grant came down in jeans and an old sweatshirt, moving toward the refrigerator like it was any other evening, and I said his name. Once, quietly, and something in my voice must have carried a register he'd never heard from me before, because he stopped with his hand still on the refrigerator door and turned around slowly. I said, "Grant, sit down, I need to tell you something." And he sat across from me at that same kitchen table, and I watched his face do the thing faces do when a person senses a conversation is about to become a different kind of conversation than they expected, a flicker of wariness under the exhaustion of the day. I said, "I know about Vanessa. I have known for 14 months. I want to describe exactly what happened across the next hour, because it is the hour I had, in some sense, been rehearsing in my head for over a year, And the reality of it was both exactly what I expected and, in a few specific ways, not what I expected at all. Grant's first reaction was denial, immediate and reflexive. "What are you talking about, Rachel? I don't know what you think you saw," and I let him get about 4 sentences into it before I said, calmly, without raising my voice, "The Bramfield Inn and Suites, room charges on the joint visa starting last August," and I watched something in his face collapse, not into honesty yet, but into the specific recognition that whatever story he'd been about to construct was not going to survive contact with actual dates and actual numbers. He moved, after that, into anger, which I had expected and which I had, over 14 months of conversations with Diane, prepared myself to simply let happen without matching it. "How dare you go through my things? You've been spying on me. This is a violation of my privacy." And I let him finish that, too, and then I said, still in the same level voice, that I hadn't gone through anything, that I'd found a hotel charge on our own joint credit card statement, doing the bookkeeping I've done for our entire marriage, and that everything after that had simply been me paying attention to a husband who had stopped being careful about hiding what he no longer seemed to think I was paying attention to. I told him about the phone in the truck console. I told him about Ned and the Peterson job that had actually finished in June. I told him, and this was the moment his anger finally broke into something else, about the doorbell camera, about February, about June, about 11 minutes of audio recorded from my own staircase in my own house while our children were at school. Grant put his head in his hands at that point, and when he looked up, something had genuinely shifted, the anger mostly gone, replaced by something closer to the exhausted honesty of a man who has finally run out of road to keep lying on. He said quietly, "How long have you really known?" And I told him the truth. 14 months, since a Sunday in August the year before, the day I found the phone in his truck when Tyler forgot his baseball glove. He asked me, and his voice actually cracked on this question in a way that surprised me, why I hadn't said anything sooner, why I'd let it go on this long, and I told him as plainly as I could that I'd made a decision early on that I was not going to blow up my life on his timeline in the middle of the worst year of my father's illness based on incomplete information and raw emotion, that I had decided instead to find out everything there was to find out and to build, quietly, an entire life that didn't depend on him, so that whenever this conversation finally happened, it would happen on ground I had already secured. It was in that same conversation, close to an hour in, that Grant told me something that confirmed the one piece of the timeline I hadn't been able to fully nail down through Sharon Whitcomb's records alone. I asked him, directly, when it had actually started with Vanessa, and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "December. The December before your dad got sick, 4 months before," and I told him, evenly, that I already knew that Sharon had traced it through the expense account records, and I watched him understand, in that moment, that I had not simply caught him. I had built, over 14 months, a complete and independently verified record of his own life that was, in some ways, more thorough than his own memory of it. I told him then that I had already retained an attorney, that a divorce petition was already drafted and ready to file, that a forensic valuation of Colston Restoration already existed, prepared through entirely proper channels, and that I was giving him exactly one choice to make in the next 24 hours. Not whether this was happening, because it was already happening and had been for months in every way that mattered, but whether it was going to happen with basic decency and cooperation on his part, or whether it was going to happen the hard way, through a courtroom with a judge, a valuation, and a documented affair timeline that started 4 months before my father was even diagnosed. All of it a matter of public record. Grant did not argue with me. I think by that point, close to 2 a.m, some part of him had simply run out of anything to argue with, and he said quietly, almost to himself, "You really had all of this ready?" And I said yes, I did. Because I had learned, over 14 months of watching you, that I could no longer afford to be a woman who found things out after they'd already cost her everything. I called Diane Ostrander at 8 the next morning, and she filed the petition that same afternoon, 3 days after my father's funeral, using the document that had been sitting ready in her Montpelier office since June. Grant was served at the Colston Restoration Office on Millbank Street on a Thursday morning, a detail I did not orchestrate for cruelty's sake. Diane's process server simply worked around the company's public business hours the way process servers do, but which had the effect, entirely outside of my control, of making the end of Grant's marriage a matter of immediate, visible knowledge to every one of his 31 employees within about an hour, because in an office that size, a certified process server walking in and asking for the owner by name does not stay quiet for long. Ned Colston called me that same evening, and I want to tell you about that call because it surprised me. I had braced myself for Ned to be angry at me, to see this as an attack on his brother, and by extension, on the family business he'd helped build. Instead, Ned's voice on the phone was rough in a way I'd never heard from him, and he said, "Rachel, I need you to know I didn't know. None of it. And I believe you," I told him, and I meant it, because everything I'd learned over 14 months had confirmed exactly that. Ned had been as much in the dark as I was for most of it. He told me that once word of the affair moved through the office that week, which it did within days, several members of his own account staff came forward with things they'd noticed and quietly not mentioned. Closed office doors at odd hours, expense reports that didn't quite add up the way Sharon Whitcomb had traced independently, and that he, as co-owner in practice, if not on paper, had made the decision entirely on his own, without my asking for it or wanting any part of it, to let Vanessa Cole go from Colston Restoration within 2 weeks, citing a straightforward policy violation regarding a relationship between a manager and a member of ownership that the company's own employee handbook, which Ned had actually written 5 years earlier, technically prohibited. I want to be honest that I felt no satisfaction hearing that. Only a kind of tired confirmation that consequences, once a lie of that size finally surfaces, tend to spread on their own into rooms you never intended to touch. Grant's mother, Ruth Colston, 71 years old, a woman who had been kind to me for 17 years, who had taught me her own mother's recipe for the scalloped potatoes I still make every Thanksgiving, called me 2 days after Grant was served. And I remember bracing myself for that call too, expecting some version of a mother defending her son. Instead, Ruth cried on the phone for several minutes before she could get a full sentence out. And when she finally did, she said, "Rachel, I raised him better than this. I don't know what happened to my son, and I'm so sorry," and she meant it completely, and she has, in the 18 months since, remained close with me and with Emma and Tyler in a way that speaks, I think, to exactly the kind of woman she actually is, someone who loved her son and was still capable of looking clearly at what he'd done and refusing to pretend it was something smaller than it was. The divorce process itself took just under 7 months from filing to final decree, which Diane told me repeatedly was remarkably fast for a case involving a business valuation of this size, almost entirely because of the 14 months of preparation that meant there was very little left to actually litigate. Grant's own attorney did attempt, briefly, to challenge Sharon Whitcomb's valuation of Colston Restoration, bringing in their own forensic accountant who tried to argue the company was worth closer to $1.4 million rather than Sharon's $2.1 million figure, largely by reclassifying a set of expenses Sharon had already anticipated and documented as personal rather than business-related months earlier. And Sharon's work held up completely under the opposing side's own examination, in large part because it had been built, deliberately, from records collected before Grant had any warning to start reshaping them. The final settlement gave me the house on Birchwood Lane outright, primary physical custody of Emma and Tyler, with a standard, generous visitation schedule for Grant, and a structured buyout of my equitable share of Colston Restoration, paid out over 4 years rather than forcing a sale of the business, an arrangement Diane recommended because it let Grant keep the company that 30 other families' livelihoods depended on, while still giving me the actual value I was owed, an outcome I was and remain genuinely at peace with, because it was fair, not because it was generous. I have not yet told you how Emma and Tyler found out, and I want to, because it is the part of this story that still costs me the most to talk about, more than any hotel receipt or recorded conversation ever did. I brought them home from Patty's house the morning after the funeral. The same morning, I had already called Diane, though I had not yet told them anything. And I made the decision, with Diane's guidance, and after a long conversation with a family therapist named Dr. Okafor, whom Diane had recommended months earlier before any of this became urgent. Precisely so I would already have a relationship in place with a professional the moment I needed one, that I would tell them together, calmly, in age-appropriate language, before they heard anything distorted through school hallways or overheard adult conversations, which in a town the size of Ashwood Falls was going to happen within days, regardless of what I did. I sat them down at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon. The same day Grant was served, though I had arranged the timing so they would hear it from me hours before any possibility of hearing it from anyone else. And I told them, as simply and honestly as I could manage, that their father and I were getting a divorce, that it was not caused by anything either of them had done, that both of us loved them completely and that would never change, and that their dad had made some choices in our marriage that weren't fair to me, choices I would answer questions about honestly if they asked, but that I was not going to force details on them they weren't ready for. Emma, 14, asked the question I had been bracing for since the moment I sat down. She asked if it had something to do with the woman at the funeral, because Emma, unlike Tyler, was old enough to have clocked the entire chapel's reaction in real time, the way the room had gone quiet, the way Sandra Whitfield had steered me toward the coffee urn, and I told her the truth, gently, that yes, it did, that her father had been seeing someone else. And I watched my 14-year-old daughter's face do something that broke my heart in a way I am still, 18 months later, not fully recovered from, a kind of instant, furious loyalty on my behalf, mixed with a grief for the version of her father she'd believed in until that exact sentence. Tyler, 11, understood less of the specifics and more of the feeling, and what he said that afternoon is something I don't think I'll ever fully get over. He asked if this meant Dad didn't love him anymore, and I told him immediately, as firmly as I have ever said anything in my life, that his father's choices about our marriage had nothing to do with how much he loved his son, that adults can fail each other in a marriage while still being completely devoted to their children. And I believe that, genuinely, about Grant as a father even now, even after everything, because whatever else is true about him, he has never once, before or after the divorce, missed a single one of Tyler's baseball games or Emma's school concerts that fell during his custody time. And I think it matters, in a story like this, to say plainly that a man can be a serial betrayer of his wife and still be, in the specific, bounded way that matters most to an 11-year-old boy, a father who shows up. We went to family therapy with Dr. Okafor together, the four of us in various combinations, for most of the following year, and I credit those sessions with a great deal of what stability Emma and Tyler have found, since, alongside the simple, unglamorous fact that I never once, in front of them, described their father as a villain, never once used them as messengers or confidants for the adult details of the divorce, a discipline that cost me something every single time Emma came home from a weekend at Grant's, asking careful, testing questions about whether I was doing okay, questions I answered honestly but simply, because I had decided, long before any of this became public, that whatever Grant had done to me, I was not going to let it cost my children a version of both their parents they could still trust in the ways that mattered to them, specifically. Grant tried, twice during the 7 months the divorce was in process, to reconcile, and I want to describe both attempts honestly because I think they reveal something true about the difference between regret and remorse, a distinction Dr. Okafor helped me articulate for myself during one of our individual sessions. The first attempt came about 6 weeks after he was served. On an evening, he'd come to pick up the kids for his scheduled weekend and lingered afterward in the driveway, asking if we could talk. And what followed was not an apology so much as an argument for why the divorce was unnecessary, that he'd ended things with Vanessa completely the day I confronted him, that people make mistakes, that 17 years and 2 children should count for more than one bad chapter. Language that I noticed, even in the moment, never once actually named what he had done as a betrayal, only as a chapter, a mistake, a thing that had happened in the passive voice rather than a thing he had chosen deliberately for 11 months before I ever found that first hotel charge. I told him, standing in that driveway, that I appreciated him saying all of that and that none of it changed anything, because my decision to end the marriage had not been made in the heat of catching him. It had been made slowly, deliberately, over 14 months of watching him choose Vanessa Cole, choose the optics of his own reputation, choose the management of my supposedly clockwork schedule, again and again at every single juncture where he could have chosen differently, including the specific juncture of walking into my father's funeral with her on his arm rather than leaving her at home, a choice that had nothing to do with old affection for me and everything to do with the same careless confidence that had let him believe, for over a year, that I would never notice any of it at all. The second attempt came 4 months later, closer to the end of the process, after Sharon Whitcomb's valuation had held up against his own accountant's challenge, and the financial terms of the settlement were largely locked in, and this time Grant's approach was different, quieter, almost defeated, showing up unannounced on a Sunday when I had the kids at a movie, and he knew, from years of our old shared calendar habits, that I'd likely be alone. He told me that day, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd first confronted him, that he understood now what he'd actually lost, not the house, not half the business, but 17 years of a specific, ordinary kind of trust he hadn't valued properly until it was gone. And I believed him. Actually, I believed that this second conversation was closer to real remorse than the first one had been. But I told him, as gently as I could manage, that believing he finally understood what he'd lost did not obligate me to hand any of it back to him, that understanding a consequence after the fact is not the same thing as having earned a different outcome, and that I had spent 14 months building a life that did not require his remorse to be complete, and I intended to keep living in that life regardless of how sincerely he now regretted losing his place in it. I want to say something here about Vanessa Cole, because I think it would be dishonest to end her part of this story with nothing but anger, even though anger was, for a long time, the easiest and most available thing I felt toward her. I never spoke to her directly, not once, through the entire 14 months or the 7 months of divorce proceedings that followed, and I have thought, since, about what I might have said if I ever had the chance, and I don't think it would have been what people probably expect. I don't think she owed me anything close to what Grant owed me. He made vows to me. She made none. What she did was still a serious betrayal of another woman, of a marriage she knew existed, and I do not absolve her of that, but the architecture of the entire deception, the scheduling, the lying about supplier conferences, the calculated waiting for a convenient moment that would make him look decent instead of monstrous, all of that was Grant's construction, built and maintained by a man who had made an actual, specific promise to me that he broke every single day for over a year while still coming home and calling me his wife. I want to go back for a moment to something my father left me that I did not discover until 3 weeks after his funeral, because it changed how I understood that entire final year of his life, and it is, I think, one of the more important pieces of this story. My father's attorney, a semi-retired man named Frank Sorrentino who had handled Walter Doyle's modest estate planning for decades, called me in mid-November to go over the will, a straightforward document that split my father's small savings and the house on Sycamore Street evenly between Danny and me, nothing complicated. But Frank also handed me a sealed envelope that afternoon, my father's handwriting on the front, simply for Rachel, and told me my father had asked him to hold it and give it to me privately, not with Danny present sometime after the funeral, whenever Frank judged the timing right. I opened it alone in my car in the parking lot outside Frank's office, and I want to share what it said as close to exactly as I can remember it, because I have read it enough times since that the words are close to permanent in me. It said, "Rachel, I don't know exactly what's been going on with you and Grant this past year, but I've watched my daughter long enough to know the difference between a woman who's just tired and a woman who's carrying something she isn't saying, and I think it's the second one. I'm not going to ask you to tell me because I know you, and I know you'll tell me when you're ready or you won't, and either way is fine. I just want you to know that whatever it is, you come from people who fix things carefully instead of panicking. Your mother taught you that as much as I did, and I trust you to handle whatever this is in your own time and your own way, better than I probably would have at your age. I love you. Take care of those kids. And for God's sake, don't let anybody make you feel small in your own life. Love, Dad. I sat in that parking lot and cried harder than I had at the actual funeral, because my father, dying, exhausted, running out of time, had still seen exactly what was happening to me, had chosen not to spend his last months worrying me with questions I wasn't ready to answer, and had instead simply trusted me to handle it, which is, I think, the single greatest gift a parent gave me in this entire story. Greater even than the wiring skills or the crossword afternoons, the simple, uncomplicated trust that I was capable of protecting myself and my children without him having to fix it for me from a hospital bed. I have thought many times since about whether he somehow knew about Grant specifically, whether some conversation in town, some detail I never learned about had reached him, or whether it really was simply 42 years of knowing his own daughter well enough to read the shape of what I was carrying without needing the specifics. I will never know for certain, and I have made a kind of peace with not knowing, because either way, the letter said the same true thing, and it is the thing I still return to on hard days. You come from people who fix things carefully instead of panicking. Patty Farrow deserves more space in this story than I have given her so far, because without her, I am not sure the 14 months I've described would have been logistically possible at all. Beyond the linen closet, beyond the mailing address, Patty was the person who covered for me at the pharmacy counter more than once, so I could drive to Montpelier for a meeting with Diane during my lunch hour. The person who sat with me in her kitchen more nights than I can count, while I cried about a marriage I hadn't yet told anyone else was ending. The person who, when I finally told her everything had been filed, simply said thank God, and then, in the same breath, asked what she could bring to help me pack up anything of Grant's that needed to leave the house, already 3 steps ahead of me, the way she has been since we were 9 years old. I don't think stories like mine get told often enough with the full weight given to the friend in the background who never once appears in the dramatic parts, but who makes every single dramatic part survivable. I want to address something directly, because I know it will occur to anyone listening carefully to this story, and I asked Diane Ostrander about it myself the same week I recorded that 11-minute conversation between Grant and Vanessa in my own kitchen. Vermont, like most states, has laws about recording conversations without consent, and I needed to know, before I built any part of my case around that recording, whether what I'd done was even legally usable, or whether I'd just spent an agonizing afternoon creating evidence that would blow up in my own face. Diane explained that Vermont is what's called a one-party consent state, meaning that as long as one participant in a conversation consents to it being recorded, in this case me, standing on my own staircase in my own home, listening to a conversation happening in a space I had every legal right to occupy, the recording is generally lawful, a fact that mattered enormously to me, not just strategically, but morally, because I would not have wanted to build my protection of my children on top of something I'd done that was itself dishonest or illegal. Diane was careful to tell me, and I want to pass this along honestly, that laws vary significantly by state, that some states require all parties to consent to a recording, and that anyone in a similar situation should absolutely verify their own state's specific law before recording anything, because doing it wrong can genuinely undermine a case rather than help it. I got lucky, in a sense, that Vermont's law lined up with what I felt compelled to do anyway. I don't think I would have stopped myself even if it hadn't, but I am glad looking back that doing the right thing for my children and doing the legally sound thing turned out to be the exact same action. There was a moment, in March during the divorce proceedings, that I think of as the closest Grant came to genuinely fighting dirty, And I want to include it because it is the part of this story that most confirms, for me, that the 14 months of quiet preparation were not paranoia, but simple, necessary foresight. Grant's attorney, a sharp, aggressive man from a firm in Burlington named Whitfield and Marsh, attempted, in a deposition, to argue that a significant portion of Colston Restoration's contract pipeline, roughly $300,000 in signed but not yet invoiced work, should be excluded from the marital valuation entirely. On the theory that these contracts had been signed after our separation date and therefore represented Grant's individually earned post-separation income rather than a jointly built asset. It was a clever argument, and it would have worked, potentially, against a less prepared case, except that Sharon Whitcomb had already, months earlier, before any of this was contested, documented the actual sales cycle timeline for Colston Restoration's typical contracts, showing, with the company's own historical data, that contracts of that size and type typically take between 8 and 11 months from initial client contact to signature, meaning every single one of those $300,000 in contracts had in fact originated from client relationships and bids initiated well before our separation, during the marriage, regardless of when the final signature happened to land. The judge sided with Sharon's analysis in full. Diane told me afterward, with something close to genuine satisfaction in her voice, that watching an opposing counsel attempt a maneuver that the other side's own forensic accountant had already anticipated and neutralized months in advance was, professionally, one of the more satisfying moments of her career. And I remember hearing that, a small, quiet vindication for every single evening I'd spent building a case I hoped I would never actually need to use. I want to tell you about one more difficult social moment, because I think it's honest to include the parts of this that weren't clean victories. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Ashwood Falls held its annual town 4th of July picnic on the Green, the same green where I'd sold Grant $40 of raffle tickets 19 years earlier. And Grant was there with the kids during his scheduled holiday time, and I was there separately with Patty. And for about 20 minutes, both of our lives, the old one and the new one, occupied the same 3 acres of grass in front of most of the town at once. It was not a scene. Nobody made it a scene. But I remember standing near the lemonade stand watching Grant push Tyler on the tire swing, laughing at something Tyler said, an entirely ordinary good moment between a father and son, and feeling a complicated grief I hadn't fully processed until that exact instant. Not grief for my marriage, which I no longer wanted back in any form, but grief for the specific, simple version of a family photograph I had once assumed my whole life would look like. The 4 of us on that green every 4th of July until the kids were grown. A picture that no longer existed and never would again. And I let myself feel that loss fully, standing there, without letting it convince me for even a second that I'd made the wrong decision. I want to tell you what happened to Vanessa Cole after she lost her job at Colston Restoration, not because it's central to my story, but because I think leaving it out would make this sound tidier than real life actually is. She left Ashwood Falls entirely within about 4 months, moved, I heard through the same quiet channels every piece of town news eventually travels through, to Rutland, where she had family, and took a bookkeeping position at a smaller company there. I heard secondhand through Denise in the Colston Restoration payroll office, who I remained friendly with despite everything, that Vanessa had, in the years since, expressed regret about the entire situation to at least one former coworker, describing herself as having been, in her own words, genuinely in love with a man who had told her repeatedly that his marriage was already essentially over before she ever got involved. A claim that I want to address plainly because I think it matters. Grant did tell her that. Sharon Whitcomb's timeline proves it couldn't have been true in December when this started, 4 months before my father was even diagnosed. Back when my marriage was, by any honest measure, simply an ordinary marriage with ordinary strains, not a marriage already over in any sense Vanessa could have reasonably believed. I don't know whether Vanessa was lied to as thoroughly as I was, in her own way, or whether she simply told herself a story she needed to believe to live with her own choices. I have decided, in the time since, that it doesn't change anything about what I owed her, which was nothing, or what Grant owed both of us, which was the truth, a debt he failed to pay to either one of us for the better part of a year. I finished the divorce process in May, 7 months after filing, and I want to describe what the following months actually looked like, because I think the ordinary texture of rebuilding a life matters as much as the dramatic parts of losing one. I stayed in the house on Birchwood Lane, which felt in the beginning strange in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, walking past Emma's height marks on the hall closet door frame every single day, sleeping in a bed that had been Grant's side and my side for 17 years, now entirely mine, a fact that felt lonely for the first few months and then, gradually, over the following year, started to feel like something closer to spaciousness instead. I repainted the bedroom that August, a soft sage green I'd wanted for a decade, and Grant had always vetoed as too feminine for a room we shared, and I remember standing in that room after the second coat dried, alone, feeling something that surprised me with how simple and complete it was. Just relief, not triumph, not vindication, just the plain relief of a room that finally looked like something I actually wanted. At the clinic, I was promoted, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, from head bookkeeper to full office manager, a role that had opened up when my longtime supervisor retired and that I applied for with a confidence I don't think I would have had access to 2 years earlier, before I'd spent 14 months proving to myself, in the hardest possible circumstances, exactly how capable I actually was of managing complexity, protecting what mattered, and executing a long plan without losing my nerve. Dr. Patterson, who runs the clinic, told me during my interview that she'd always known I could handle more responsibility. She'd just been waiting for me to believe it myself. And I remember thinking, sitting in that interview, how strange and how fitting it was that the same 14 months that cost me my marriage had also, almost as a side effect, handed me the clearest evidence of my own competence I had ever had. Emma is 16 now, a junior at Ashwood Falls Regional High School, and she has, in the time since, become close with a small group of friends whose parents I've come to know well through the ordinary machinery of high school life. Carpools and away games, and a single memorable prom dress shopping trip to Burlington that took 4 hours and ended with tears of the good kind in a dressing room. Tyler is 13, still plays baseball, still keeps a photograph of my father on his dresser next to a small carved wooden box, one of the last things Walter Doyle ever made in his workshop that he specifically left to Tyler by name in the list he dictated to Danny and me on that Tuesday afternoon in September, a fact that Tyler has never once, even now, fully understood the emotional weight of, which is, I think, exactly as it should be for a 13-year-old boy who just likes having something his grandfather built with his own hands. I should mention one more small thread that closed itself out quietly in the months after the divorce, because I think it rounds out the picture of Ashwood Falls as a town that, for all its small-town gossip, also has a real capacity for decency when it matters. The volunteer fire department, the same organization my father had helped run summer fundraisers for since before I was born, dedicated its annual pancake breakfast the following spring to his memory, a gesture the current chief arranged without my asking, printing a small line on the event flyer in honor of Walter Doyle, 41 years of service to this town, and Danny and I stood together at that breakfast, flipping pancakes at the same griddle station my father used to run himself, and it was, in its own unassuming way, one of the more healing mornings of that entire year and a half, standing in a school gymnasium full of neighbors who had known exactly what our family had been through and simply showed up anyway, the way this town has always shown up for the people who spent their lives showing up for it first. I want to go back and describe my own individual therapy sessions with Dr. Okafor in more detail because I think the interior work I did during those 14 months and in the year that followed matters as much to this story as any document in Patty's linen closet. I started seeing her alone in October of the first year, 2 months after finding that hotel charge, specifically because I recognized, even then, that I could not sustain the level of controlled composure I was maintaining at home without somewhere to put the parts of myself that composure required me to set aside. Dr. Okafor's office is in a converted farmhouse on Route 14 outside Bramfield, a 40-minute drive that became, over that year, one of the only hours of the week that belonged entirely to me. No children, no grant, no bookkeeping. Just an hour to say out loud the things I could not afford to say anywhere else. I remember one session in particular around the 6-month mark in February, not long after I'd watched the doorbell footage of Vanessa on my own porch, when I told Dr. Okafor that I was worried I had become someone cold, someone capable of sitting across from her own husband every night, watching him sleep, and calmly building a legal case against him instead of screaming the truth in his face. And I asked her directly whether that made me as dishonest, in my own way, as he was being. I remember her answer clearly because it reframed something for me that I badly needed reframed. She said, "Rachel, there's a difference between deception and discretion. Deception is hiding something to gain an advantage you're not entitled to. Discretion is protecting something you're entitled to protect, on a timeline that serves the people who actually depend on you, rather than the timeline that would feel most satisfying in the moment. You are not lying to Grant about who you are. You are simply declining to hand him a warning he does not deserve, at a moment that would cost your children more than it would cost you." That distinction became something I returned to constantly in the months that followed, every time some tired, frightened part of me wondered if I was being unfair to a man who, whatever else he was doing, still came home every night and kissed me on the forehead like nothing was wrong. Dr. Okafor also helped me understand something about my own father's illness that I hadn't been able to see clearly on my own, which is that grief and vigilance are not actually opposites, the way I'd assumed they were during that year, two competing demands splitting my attention in half. She pointed out in one of our sessions that spring that the same part of me that had spent 14 years managing my father's slow decline with careful, unsentimental attention to detail, watching his medication schedule, tracking his pain levels, noticing small changes in his appetite before he mentioned them himself, was the exact same part of me that was now tracking hotel charges and doorbell footage with equal precision. It was not two different women managing two different crises. It was one woman using the one set of skills she actually had, careful attention and patient documentation, to take care of everyone who depended on her, her dying father, and her unraveling marriage, at the same time, because that is simply who I have always been, long before any of this started, the daughter of a man who diagnosed wiring faults room by room instead of guessing. I brought Danny into more of this than I've described so far in the months after the funeral, and I want to include a specific evening at his house in Burlington, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized, because it changed something in how I saw the whole year in retrospect. Danny's wife, Melissa, had made dinner, and after the kids had all gone off to watch a movie in the other room, Emma and Tyler included, since we'd driven up for the weekend, Danny poured us each a glass of wine and said, almost out of nowhere, "Rach, I keep thinking about how much of that year you carried completely alone, and I still don't fully understand how you did both things at once." And I told him, honestly, that I hadn't done it entirely alone, that Patty had carried an enormous share of it, that Diane and Sharon had given me the professional scaffolding I couldn't have built myself, but that yes, there had been a specific, particular kind of loneliness to being the only person for a long stretch of that year who knew the complete shape of what was actually happening in my own house. And Danny reached across the table and took my hand, the way our father used to, and said, "I'm just glad you're not alone in it anymore." And I think that dinner, more than almost any single moment in the divorce process itself, was when I finally let the whole year exhale out of me in front of someone who loved me without needing anything back from me in that moment. There is one more piece of the 14 months I haven't told you about yet, and I've saved it until now because it is, in some ways, the piece I am least comfortable admitting to. even though I think it is important to include if I'm going to tell this story honestly, instead of just telling the parts that make me sound wise and composed the entire time. In late winter of that year, around the same time as the postnuptial agreement conversation, I came very close, twice, to simply confronting Grant early, to abandoning the entire careful plan out of sheer emotional exhaustion. The first time was a Tuesday night in February, a bad night. My father had just started a new round of medication with difficult side effects. Tyler had a stomach bug, Emma was struggling with a math class she usually excelled in, and Grant came home at 9:40 with a story about a supplier meeting that ran long. And I stood in the kitchen doorway, dish towel still in my hand, and felt every single thing I'd been holding for 6 months rise up my throat at once. And I opened my mouth, fully intending in that specific exhausted moment to say all of it, right there, standing in my socks on the kitchen tile. What stopped me that night was Tyler calling down the stairs that he'd thrown up again, and the entire moment simply dissolved into logistics, cleaning sheets, checking his temperature, calling the pediatrician's after-hours line, and by the time the house was quiet again, close to midnight, the specific white-hot urgency of that moment had passed, and I lay awake instead doing the math again, the same math I'd already done a dozen times, about what confronting him that night, exhausted, unprepared, with no attorney yet retained, no valuation yet started, would actually accomplish beyond the temporary relief of finally saying it out loud. I want to be honest that I don't think restraint in that moment made me a stronger person than a woman who would have said it anyway. I think I was simply lucky that circumstance interrupted me before I acted on an impulse that would have cost me the advantage of surprise I hadn't finished building yet. The second time was in April, a full year after the diagnosis, on the anniversary of the day we found out about my father's cancer, a day that was already difficult on its own terms, and Grant said something particularly hollow that evening about how hard this year had been for him too, watching Walter struggle, and something in me nearly snapped at the sheer nerve of it. Watching my husband perform grief over my father's illness while actively betraying me throughout the exact same period. And I remember going into the bathroom, running the water so no one would hear, and crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry in months, not sad tears so much as furious ones, before washing my face, going back downstairs, and asking Grant, in a perfectly ordinary voice, whether he wanted the leftover lasagna reheated. I include both of these moments because I think stories like mine sometimes get told in a way that makes the woman at the center sound like she felt nothing but cold, controlled purpose for 14 straight months. And that was never true for me, not for a single day of it. What was true was that I kept choosing over and over, sometimes by inches, sometimes only because my son threw up at exactly the right moment, to protect the plan rather than satisfy the immediate feeling, and I think that specific, repeated choosing, made imperfectly and painfully rather than effortlessly, is actually the truer and more useful story than the version where a woman simply becomes calm and stays that way. Discipline, I learned that year, is not the absence of the feeling that would derail you. It is choosing the plan again, specifically in the moment when the feeling is loudest, and then choosing it again the next time, and the time after that, for as many months as it takes. I also want to mention, because it surprised me and because I think it's a useful detail for anyone in a similar situation, that I made exactly one mistake during those 14 months that could have unraveled everything, and I only realized how close it came to disaster months later. In March, distracted and exhausted after a bad week with my father, I mistakenly used the home Wi-Fi instead of my phone's cellular data to log into the Bramfield Credit Union account, a lapse of maybe 90 seconds before I caught my own error and switched networks. But 90 seconds that would have been entirely sufficient. I learned later from Sharon Whitcomb, for anyone actively monitoring the home network's traffic logs, to see the domain name of a financial institution I had no obvious reason to be accessing. Grant, as far as I ever determined, never noticed, either because he wasn't monitoring the network as closely as I'd feared, or because that particular week he was, based on the timeline Sharon later reconstructed. entirely occupied with his own arrangements involving Vanessa, and simply wasn't paying attention to anything at home at all. But I share that mistake because I think it's important to be honest that even 14 months of careful planning contained real moments of human error and real luck, not a flawless operation executed without a single misstep. And I would rather tell you the true, occasionally sloppy version of how I protected myself than a cleaner version that might make someone in a similar situation feel like anything less than perfect execution means they've failed. I think it's worth describing, in more detail than I have so far, exactly what my ordinary days looked like during that 14-month period, because I think the sheer, grinding ordinariness of it is part of what made it survivable, and part of what I want anyone listening to this to understand if they ever find themselves in a similar position. A typical Tuesday, say, in that October, the second one, the one before my father died, looked like this. I woke at 5:30, before Grant, before the kids, and used that first quiet hour to check the doorbell camera history from the previous day, review the joint credit card transactions that had posted overnight, and twice a month, log into the Bramfield account on my phone's data to confirm the automatic transfer from my paycheck had gone through cleanly. I made breakfast for Emma and Tyler, drove Tyler to the bus stop because he insisted at 11 that walking there alone made him look more grown up, though he still wanted his mother in the car for the 2 minutes it took to get there. I drove to my father's house on Sycamore Street, spent an hour helping the morning hospice aide with his feeding tube and his medications, sat with him for 20 minutes doing the crossword, which had become, by then, more about the ritual of doing it together than about either of us actually caring whether we solved it. I drove to the clinic, worked a full 8-hour day managing accounts for a 14-person medical practice, took a lunch break most days that involved either a phone call with Diane or Sharon, scheduled carefully around the clinic's slower midday hours, picked up Tyler from practice or Emma from student council, made dinner, helped with homework, and fell asleep most nights somewhere around 11, having spent, across that single ordinary Tuesday, perhaps 90 minutes total on the entire architecture of protecting my own future, folded invisibly into a day that otherwise looked, to every single person who saw me, exactly like every other day of my life had always looked. I think people who haven't lived through something like this sometimes imagine it as a dramatic, cinematic undertaking, secret meetings in parking garages, tense phone calls in hushed voices. And there was some of that, certainly, the actual meetings with Diane, the library printouts, the 90 seconds of held breath every time I opened the Bramfield account. But the overwhelming majority of those 14 months was simply this: ordinary exhaustion, ordinary parenting, ordinary grief, with one additional quiet task layered underneath all of it, checked and maintained the way you'd maintain anything else important. A car, a garden, a chronic health condition, not with constant high drama, but with steady, unglamorous attention that most weeks felt more like a chore than a crisis. I want to describe one particular Sunday, that fall, because it captures something about the specific loneliness of that period that I haven't fully conveyed yet. It was a beautiful October afternoon, unseasonably warm, and Grant had taken Tyler to a Rotary pancake breakfast fundraiser that morning. One of the events my father used to help organize before his illness made that impossible, and I sat on our back porch with Emma, who was reading, and I remember watching my daughter, 14 years old, completely unaware that the ground under her entire family was already quietly shifting, and feeling a specific kind of grief that had nothing to do with Grant at all. Grief for the fact that I was carrying a truth that was going to eventually rearrange her whole childhood, and she did not know it yet. And there was nothing kind or useful I could do in that moment except let her have one more ordinary Sunday afternoon before the rearranging started. And I sat there, in the sun, and let her read her book, and said nothing. And I think that specific kind of protective silence, chosen deliberately for her sake rather than for my own convenience, is something I still stand behind completely, even now, even having watched how hard the actual telling eventually was for her. Reverend Ashby, I should mention, became someone I confided in partially, though not completely, during that period. Not in any formal counseling sense, but in the ordinary way a small-town pastor ends up knowing pieces of everyone's life, whether he goes looking for it or not. He noticed, sometime in the winter, that I'd started coming to the Wednesday evening prayer service alone, without Grant, something I'd never done in 17 years of marriage. And he asked me, gently, after the service one week, if everything was all right at home, and I told him a partial truth, that Grant and I were going through a difficult season, that I wasn't ready to talk about details yet. And he said something I've held on to since, that he'd pray for wisdom for me rather than for any particular outcome, because in his experience, people usually already knew, somewhere inside themselves, what the right outcome was going to have to be, and what they actually needed help with was the courage and the patience to get there in one piece, which is, I think, as accurate a description of what those 14 months actually required from me as anyone gave me the entire time. I want to talk about money in slightly more detail than I have so far, not because I think the specific numbers matter to anyone listening in themselves, but because I think the general shape of the financial planning matters enormously to any woman who might find herself needing to do something similar, and I would rather be genuinely useful than falsely modest about the specifics. Diane Ostrander told me, in one of our earliest meetings, something I have repeated to at least 4 friends since who came to me quietly, after word of my divorce spread through Ashwood Falls, asking careful questions about their own marriages. She said that the single biggest predictor of how well a woman comes through a contested divorce is not how angry she has a right to be, and not even the quality of her attorney, though that matters enormously, but how much financial and documentary preparation she managed to do before the other side knew a fight was coming. Once a spouse knows a divorce is likely, Diane told me, every single one of his financial decisions from that point forward will be shaped, consciously or not, by self-interest in a way it wasn't before. Moving money, delaying invoices, minority discounts on business valuations, disputing what counts as marital property. The window where you can gather clean, honest, undisputed information about your actual financial life together is the window before he knows, and that window, once it closes, does not reopen. That single piece of advice is, more than anything else Diane ever told me, the thing I would want another woman in a similar position to hear clearly. It is not about being sneaky or vindictive. It is about understanding that marriage, for all its intimacy, is also, unavoidably, a financial partnership, and that partnership deserves the same clear-eyed documentation any reasonable person would want before making a major decision. Whether that documentation ever gets used adversarially or simply sits quietly in a folder, never needed, because the marriage turns out fine after all. I want to be honest that if I had gone through that entire 14-month process and discovered, at the end of it, that I had misread everything, that the hotel charges had some explanation I hadn't considered, that the phone and the message and the recording all somehow resolved into an innocent misunderstanding, I would not have regretted a single hour I spent building that separate account, consulting Diane, or documenting anything, because the folder in Patty's linen closet would simply have stayed closed, unused, a piece of quiet insurance I never had to file a claim against, the way you don't regret paying for homeowner's insurance the year your house doesn't burn down. I also want to be honest about the cost of all of this, because it would be dishonest to describe 14 months of careful preparation as though it came free. I paid Diane's initial retainer, $4,000, out of the last of my mother's inheritance money, before I'd redirected any of my own paycheck into the new account, and I paid Sharon Whitcomb's forensic accounting fees, another $6,000 over the following months, out of that same account, as it slowly grew, money that, had my marriage somehow turned out to be salvageable. After all, I would have spent for nothing, a risk I made peace with early on because the alternative, discovering too late that I had no independent resources at all, felt like a far greater risk to accept. I think it's important to say plainly that not every woman in a difficult marriage has access to $11,000 of separate inheritance money to start this kind of process with, and I do not want to suggest that my path is available in exactly this form to everyone. But I do think the underlying principle scales down to whatever resources a person actually has. Opening even a small separate account, even $50 at a time, consulting even a single free legal aid clinic consultation, documenting even without hiring a forensic accountant, because the principle that matters is not the size of the folder. It's the simple discipline of not waiting until the crisis is already fully upon you to start building the thing that will catch you. It has been a year and a half now since my father's funeral, since Grant walked through that side door of the Ashwood Falls Community Chapel with Vanessa Cole on his arm, and I find myself, on quiet evenings, still returning to that specific moment more often than I return to almost anything else from that entire period, not because it hurt the most, though it did hurt, but because it is the moment the two halves of that year finally collided in front of witnesses, the private work I had been doing since August of the year before, and the public unraveling Grant chose, entirely on his own, to force into a chapel full of mourners. I think about how differently that day could have gone if I had not spent 14 months preparing for it, how I might have actually collapsed in that pew, or screamed, or done something in front of 200 people that I would have had to carry alongside my grief for my father for the rest of my life. Instead, I got to bury my father with dignity on my own terms, and I got to end my marriage on my own terms too, a few hours later, in my own kitchen, in a conversation Grant did not see coming, even though I had been building toward it for over a year. I want to tell you where everyone stands now because I think endings matter, even quiet ones. My father's house on Sycamore Street sold last spring to a young family with 2 small children, a sale Danny and I both found harder emotionally than either of us expected, watching moving boxes go into a house that had held 40 years of our family's ordinary life. But the young mother who bought it told me, the day we handed over the keys, that she'd noticed my father's old workshop out back and asked if it was all right if she kept it as a workshop rather than converting it into anything else. And something about that specific kindness, a stranger choosing to preserve the one room in that house that mattered most to me, made the whole transaction feel less like a loss and more like a gift being passed carefully to someone who would actually use it. Danny and Melissa are doing well in Burlington, and our relationship has genuinely deepened since that year, in a way I'm grateful for, even though I wish it hadn't taken losing our father and my marriage in the same 12 months to get us there. Colston Restoration is still operating, still employing 30-some families in Ashwood Falls and the surrounding counties, and I have made a specific, deliberate peace with the fact that my equitable share of its value is still being paid out to me, monthly, through Grant's continued success running it, because Diane helped me see, early in that process, that wanting the company to fail out of anger toward Grant would only end up hurting the very buyout payments I was relying on, along with 30 families who had nothing to do with any of this. Grant remarried, actually, about 10 months ago, a woman named Colleen Hartwick he met through, of all things, a construction industry conference, someone I've met exactly twice, at pickup and drop-off for the kids, and who has been, from what Emma and Tyler tell me, kind to them in the ordinary, unremarkable way a decent step-parent figure should be, which is honestly all I have ever wanted for my children in whatever version of a blended family they end up living inside. I still work at the Ashwood Falls Regional Medical Clinic, still as office manager now, a role I've grown to genuinely love, still see Patty Farrow most weeks, still attend Reverend Ashby's Wednesday service some evenings, alone, the way I started doing during the hardest months of that year, a habit that outlasted the crisis that created it and became something I simply do now because it centers me. Emma is looking at colleges, mostly in New England, close enough that I don't let myself think too hard yet about how much smaller this house is going to feel in 2 years when she leaves for the first one that accepts her. Tyler is taller than me now, a fact that still catches me by surprise most mornings, still keeps his grandfather's carved wooden box on his dresser, still plays baseball, still, in the specific unbothered way of a boy who was protected carefully enough during the hardest year of his childhood, mostly just gets to be a regular 13-year-old rather than a child defined by his parents' divorce. I think, if I am honest, about what I would want to say to a woman sitting exactly where I sat 14 months before that funeral, holding a hotel receipt or a strange text message, or just a feeling in her stomach that something about her marriage has quietly stopped matching what her husband tells her it is. I would tell her that she does not have to choose the way it can feel in that first raw week between blowing everything up immediately and simply enduring it forever. There is a third option, slower and less satisfying in the moment, but I believe stronger in almost every case, which is to get quiet, get informed, and get prepared on your own timeline before you say a single word, so that whatever your husband eventually does, whether he confesses on his own or gets caught by his own carelessness, or, in my case, walks his mistress into your father's funeral because he has stopped believing you're paying close enough attention to notice. You are not standing there discovering your entire situation for the first time in that exact moment. You already know. You are already standing on ground you built yourself, and the only thing left to decide is when, not whether, you finally say so out loud. I drove out to the Ashwood Falls Town Cemetery a few weeks ago, on what would have been my father's 76th birthday, the way I do most years now, and I sat by his headstone for a while, next to my mother's, the two of them together again the way they'd been for most of my childhood, and I told him, out loud, the way I sometimes do, even though I know how that sounds, about Emma's college applications, and Tyler's growth spurt, and the sage green bedroom, and Danny and Melissa's youngest making the honor roll. All the small, ordinary updates a daughter gives a parent who is no longer there to ask for them herself. And I told him, too, because I had never quite said this part out loud to him, even in the year and a half since he'd been gone, that I was sorry I hadn't told him the truth that last year, about Grant, about any of it, and that I hoped he understood it had been a gift I was trying to give him, not a secret I was keeping from him. The same way his letter had told me he understood exactly that kind of choice, without needing it explained. I think about his letter often. Still, the one Frank Sorrentino handed me 3 weeks after the funeral, the one that told me I came from people who fix things carefully instead of panicking. I did not know, when my father wrote those words, sometime in his final months, weak and running out of time, exactly how literally I would end up living them out. Quietly opening an account in a town 18 miles away, quietly hiring an attorney, quietly documenting 14 months of a marriage dissolving in slow motion, all of it carried out with the same patient, methodical attention my father brought to a wiring fault, room by room, breaker by breaker, never guessing, never rushing, simply following the evidence until the whole picture became undeniable. I don't think he could have known the specifics, but I think somehow 42 years of knowing his daughter let him write exactly the sentence I would need most, at exactly the moment I would need it most, which is, I have come to believe, one of the last and best gifts a parent can give a child, not the absence of hardship, but the quiet, permanent confidence that you were raised by someone who believed, all the way to the end, that you already had what it took to handle whatever came next. If there is one thing I want anyone listening to this story to carry away with them, it is this. The version of me who sat frozen in my own driveway holding my son's baseball glove in one hand and my husband's second phone in the other did not feel strong in that moment. I felt sick and scared and completely unprepared for what I was looking at. Whatever strength people see in this story now, looking back at it from the outside, was not something I had already, waiting inside me, ready to deploy. It was something I built, slowly, one quiet decision at a time, across 14 difficult months, most of which felt, while I was living them, less like courage and more like simply getting through one more ordinary, exhausting day without falling apart. I think that is actually the most useful thing this story can offer anyone standing where I once stood. You do not need to already be the strong woman in this story before you start. You only need to start quietly, one small step at a time, and trust that the strength accumulates the same slow way everything else worth having does. and that by the time you actually need it, on some ordinary Tuesday you can't yet predict, it will already be there waiting for you. The way mine was waiting for me in a chapel doorway on a cold October morning, when my husband walked in 40 minutes late with another woman on his arm, and I discovered, with something closer to quiet readiness than despair, that I already knew exactly what I was going to do next. There's a small coda to this story I want to include, because a few of the women who reached out to me quietly after word of the divorce spread through Ashwood Falls asked me the same specific question, more than once, and I think the answer deserves a place here rather than staying private. They asked whether I ever regretted waiting 14 months, whether some part of me wished I had simply confronted Grant the day I found that first hotel charge, thrown the whole thing into the open immediately instead of carrying it silently for over a year. I've turned that question over many times, in therapy, in the car on long drives, in the quiet of the sage green bedroom late at night, and my honest answer has not changed. I do not regret the 14 months. I regret that they were necessary at all, which is a different thing entirely. I regret that I married a man capable of building a second life in careful parallel to our first one. I regret every hour Grant spent managing my father's illness as a scheduling inconvenience rather than a tragedy happening to people he claimed to love. But the 14 months themselves, the account in Bramfield, the folder in Patty's linen closet, the recording from my own staircase, the valuation Sharon Whitcomb built with such patient precision, none of that is where the damage in this story came from. That was simply me, methodically, unglamorously, refusing to let his choices become my children's catastrophe as well. I think about Emma and Tyler most of all when I answer that question, because the honest truth is that the version of this story where I confronted Grant the week I found that first hotel charge is a version where I would have walked into a fight with no attorney, no valuation, no documentation beyond a single suspicious credit card line, against a husband who ran a $2 million business and who would have had, from that exact moment forward, every incentive and every opportunity to reshape the financial picture before anyone else could verify what it had actually looked like beforehand. I think about what that version of the divorce might have cost Emma and Tyler: a longer, uglier fight, a smaller settlement, a mother who had to rebuild credibility and resources from a position of disadvantage rather than one of quiet, complete preparation. I chose the harder, slower, lonelier path specifically because it was the one that protected them best. And watching Emma thrive in her junior year, watching Tyler still sleep soundly in the only house he's ever known, still keeping his grandfather's carved box on his dresser without a single financial worry disrupting his ordinary 13-year-old life, tells me every single day that it was the correct choice, even on the nights during that year when it felt like the loneliest one. Reverend Ashby said something to me once, near the very end of that year, that I've carried with me since, standing outside the chapel after a Wednesday service, the same chapel where my father's funeral would be held a few months later, the same chapel where I'd married Grant 17 years earlier. He said, "Rachel, I've watched a lot of people in this town go through hard seasons, and the ones who come through it whole are almost never the ones who reacted the fastest. They're the ones who stayed clear-eyed the longest. I did not know, standing there that evening, exactly how much longer I would need to stay clear-eyed, or exactly what shape the ending would eventually take. A chapel doorway, a mistress in a black dress a shade too fitted for mourning, a kitchen table conversation that lasted until 2 in the morning. But I knew, even then, that clear-eyed was the only way through. I trusted myself to survive intact. And looking back now, from the other side of all of it, with my children settled, and my own name back on a house I love, and a life that finally, fully, belongs only to me, I can say with complete confidence that it was. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, if you believe, the way I do now, that the truth is always worth the patience it takes to uncover it properly, and that protecting yourself and the people who depend on you is never something to apologize for, please subscribe for a new true story every single day, and share this with anyone in your life who might need to hear. today that it is never too late and never too early to start quietly building the ground you'll need to stand on.